England in 1815. By Elie. A History of the English People. In the 19th century. England in 1815. The Liberal Awakening to 4. Imperialism and the Rise of Labour. The Triumph of Reform. Victorian Years. The Rule of Democracy. A History of the English People. In the 19th century. Introduction. ALL students of English history, and all who desire to read it for mingled pleasure and profit in their leisure hours, will welcome a complete and revised edition of the late M. Halevy's A History of the English People in the 19th Century, in which the posthumous volume, on the period of Peel and Cobden, is brought into its place in the full series. The earlier volumes have for long been the most complete and philosophic account of the period from 1815 to 1840, and the present volume, which is purely an analysis of the nature of British politics, life, and society at the time of Waterloo, is a window into the mind and state of this country unrivaled for width and the clarity of its exposition. Having thus introduced his subject, Halevy, as if to complete the framework at the outset of his task, then turned to the end of his period and published his epilogue in 2 volumes, dealing with the period 1895 to 1914. Those who were teaching the period at the time will never forget the effect of this first full and impartial presentation of English politics in these 19 years. Previously the period had lain in that dangerous twilight which always rests upon the years immediately antecedent to the present day, when the only guides are some biographies of statesmen, some hasty and often partial contemporary histories, and the recollection, always biased and sometimes curiously inaccurate, of those who have themselves lived through the events of which they speak. The appearance of Halevy's epilogue was more than a searchlight, it was a dawn. His quiet and thoughtful analysis, his careful presentation of complicated facts and contrasting opinions, gave us firm ground to stand upon. And in his full and varied references to authorities and sources there was an invitation to the student to delve further, to confirm and perhaps to correct the author's conclusions. University faculties could then prescribe the period with confidence for academic study, general readers could approach it with an assurance that they were guided by no mere partisan. In many respects a foreign historian has some advantages over a native as an historian of a country. Passions, prejudices, and // Introduction. Resentments which the most high-minded English writer can never completely shake off are in him absent, or at least of minor force. He sees the nation from outside and, in a sense, from above. He can measure the strength of political and intellectual sentiments the better, because he is not himself impelled by them. These advantages Halevy had. But there are also disadvantages under which the foreign writer may labor. He may master all the sources for his task, he may leave no important authority unread, and yet may fail to understand the atmosphere of the country of which he speaks. Subtle shades of feeling may escape him, sects, parties, and factions may be wrongly labeled, too easily classed together or too abruptly separated. But it is just in this respect that Halevy is peculiarly endowed. In every part of the period he examines the texture of which English life and politics is composed, the religious sects and intellectual coteries, and unravels them with extraordinary skill. Utilitarians or Benthamites are explained and analyzed and yet never left in isolation. The free-thinking radical is not crudely opposed to the evangelical reformer, but their similarities and affinities are brought out also. Dissent or nonconformity is never presented as a simple phenomenon, but the differing nature of the sects is portrayed with a subtlety that may surprise even those who believe they understand the nature of their own dissenting traditions. There is the contrast between the hard-thinking, rational responsibility of the Presbyterians and the emotionalism of the Wesleyans and the Wilberforces, between the extreme isolation of the Quakers and the contentious zeal of the Congregationalists, always the most political and republican of the sects. The Church of England is appreciated and understood, for Halevy knew his Oxford well and was an honoured and welcome visitor there. The nature of the Tractarian or Oxford movement is exposed, and the double force of the Low Church and the Broad Church which resisted it is explained. Even English 19th-century Catholicism, with its mixture of retiring old-fashioned Catholics and proselytizing converts, is presented with skill and sympathy. Perhaps the greatest obstacle to a Frenchman's understanding of English life is the nature of English religious sentiment, which often remains a closed book to those who are either Orthodox Catholics or freethinkers. Another French savant, Taine, in his notes sur l'Angleterre, made a remarkably sympathetic picture of the England of his day, but without that extreme sensitiveness to the more delicate tones which Halévy shows throughout his work. This history is called a history of the English people in the 19th century, as the author adopted the word by which the realm and people of Great Britain are universally known on the continent. But Halévy did not fail to appreciate the importance of our national variations. The first volume examines the state of both Ireland and Scotland, social, intellectual, and economic, with the greatest care. Indeed, the pages in which he explains the nature of Scottish thought at the beginning of the 19th century, this rationalist Protestantism or intellectual Calvinism, are a masterpiece of philosophical analysis, to outsiders a revelation, to Scotsmen a most moving evocation of the springs of Scottish character. While Halévy's gifts are at their highest in his portrayal and unraveling of the mysterious strands of religious, political, and intellectual ideas, he is also an historian of his age and gives high place to the economic changes and factors which form so large a part of English history at this or indeed any other period. The growth of external trade, the problems of an industrial exporting nation facing the choice of grasping mercantile supremacy at the cost of losing the balance between town and country, are never left out of sight. And this analysis is mingled with an appreciation of the importance of different areas of the country, above all of the strange New England of the industrial north, the radical belt between Trent and Tweed with its projecting bastion in Birmingham. The reader can understand how Manchester could become the name not only of a political force but also a gospel, how Cobden and Bright were not only powerful but even terrible figures to the politicians of the South, the demagogues from the North who rode so dangerously the Pegasus of free trade above the whirlwind of Chartism. For Halévy has this gift that he never accepts any easy or smooth once scion of a period in which the different forces and factors perform their ordered evolutions. History to him is always life with the lid off. This awareness of the furor of politics may make him perhaps a little too severe to some of the more vehement and angular figures in British politics. Tied. Introduction. Such as Canning, Cobden, and Joseph Chamberlain, and too keenly appreciative of the rounder and more quietly persuasive personalities, such as Peel. But in this he is at least in sympathy with the ideas of the average man of the period who, while stimulated by the agitators, one might even say the magicians of politics, preferred to trust the master masons, the men of sense and practice who were concerned to direct and preserve the state. It will always be a matter of infinite regret that we shall never have from Halévy's pen the volumes in which Peel's inspired disciple, Gladstone, dominates English politics, nor will we enjoy his appreciation of the qualities of Disraeli in the days of his fullest influence and authority. History is a matter not only of knowledge but also of reflection. The greatest historians are those who first of all ask the right questions. Halévy's attitude is primarily that of the inquirer. His apprenticeship to English history lay not through factual monographs but in his now celebrated La Formation du Radicalisme Philosophique, first published in 1901, and it was followed characteristically by a series of articles in the Revue de Paris on La naissance du Methodisme en Angleterre. He was the historian of ideas before he was the historian of events. And this speculative attitude is evident throughout the present work. He asks questions, and the accepted modes of French prose writing are more favorable to this method than is English prose. This interrogative approach has two great merits. It presents a problem more clearly than a merely expository style. It arouses the attention and expectation of the reader, who eagerly awaits the answer. It also discourages dogmatism and easy certainty. For if the question comes before the answer, then the answer may be less credulously accepted. Nor does Halévy always answer all his questions, at least he often provides imperfect and contingent answers, as he is too good an historian not to know that the final and conclusive answer may never be found. In this respect he has something in common with the English constitutional historian, Maitland, who had the peculiar gift of taking the reader into his confidence and sharing with him not only his knowledge but his doubts. A remarkable exam. Introduction. PLE of Halevy's interrogative method can be found in a long series of questions in which, almost satirically, he inquires wherein lay the superiority of the British Navy over the French during the Revolutionary Wars, and again he fails to find a conclusive answer. The fact of English superiority remains. There is one other quality which will commend this book to all but the dullest and least self-critical readers. Halevy's admiration for the England which he knows so well is evident throughout, but he has also a keen eye for the weakness and absurdities of the English temperament. Above all, he has a clear-sighted understanding of the limits of the easy idealism and misplaced crusading zeal which have so often impelled Englishmen to attempt to set the world to rights, while confused in their minds as to the ends and ludicrously incompetent as to the means. The butter-fingered quixotry of John Bull in some of his moods arouses in the author an urbane smile. But unlike many foreigners, and many Englishmen as well, he does not mistake ignorant zeal for rank hypocrisy, and the dreams and visions of England in her great apostolic age are seen steadily and whole, in their thoughtless folly as well as in their moral grandeur. Halevy is liberally endowed with quality which Gibbon and Macaulay never adequately possessed, but which Englishmen profess to love with proprietary pride, the balance and sanity which is a product of good humour. Pembroke College, copyright R.B. McCasham. Oxford. January, 1949. Translator's note: speech to the legislature that his departure was not likely to be immediate. I think we are now too strong for him here. And on June 15 he was engaged in arranging a combined invasion of France by the three Allied armies, when he learnt that Napoleon had outflanked his left and attacked the Prussian outposts. The battle had now begun, and these raw troops, who had never yet seen war, and were regarded with contempt by their own general, atoned, by a resistance worthy of the Peninsula veterans, for their commander's incompetent strategy. Napoleon's genius had not failed him. The plan he had formed would undoubtedly have given him the victory, could battles be won by plans. He thrust his army like a wedge between the left flank of the English army, which he had taken by surprise, and the Prussian right flank. It was his intention to thrust Wellington's army to the left and Blucher's to the right, crush each in turn, and then march upon Brussels. But the spirit of his troops was no longer what it had been 10 years earlier, at Austerlitz or Jena. It was now the enemy who were the most determined on victory. The Prussians, far from scattering before the onslaught, kept up an obstinate resistance, and finally retreated in good order, and the French had so lost heart that they would not pursue nor even make sure of the direction of their retreat. The British army came off even better, repulsed Ney's attacks, and retreated on Brussels only at the news of the Prussian retreat and to avoid isolation. Of the two generals, Wellington and Blucher, who combined the retreat of both armies to concentrate them in the rear. If it was Wellington, then it must be admitted that his plans contributed to the final success, but, after all, when Blucher joined him on the evening of the 18th, the French defeat was already assured, after a day of promiscuous slaughter, the details of which, according to his own subsequent avowal, he had failed to grasp. The battle, he wrote, began, I believe, at 11. It is impossible to say when each important occurrence took place nor in what order. Repeated attacks were made along the whole front of the center of the position by cavalry and infantry till 7 at night. How many I cannot tell. Napoleon did not maneuver at all. He just moved forward in the old style in columns, and was driven off in the old style. Of the Allies 22,000 men had been slain or wounded, of the French 40,000. The campaign was concluded with a truly Napoleonic seal writing. The French army broke up after Waterloo, just as the Prussian army had dispersed, 9 years before, after Jena. On June 29 the Allies arrived for the second time beneath the walls of Paris. 18. Victory had been won, peace seemed at length assured, and the constitutional problem called for solution. What, in time of peace, was to become of this vast standing army, the creation in its entirety of the last 20 years? Could the government make up its mind to disband it? If, however, it were not disbanded, was it possible to keep so large a number of men under arms without endangering those anti-militarist traditions which were an essential part of the British Constitution? We may grant that on this point the fears of the Liberal opposition appear at first sight well founded, for nowhere else were the effects of the Tory reaction so evident. Already, in 1814, the dissatisfaction of the Whigs had found expression in Parliament. The government had decided to keep under arms during peace a certain number of militia regiments arbitrarily selected. The decision was denounced as unconstitutional, and was the subject of heated debates. The opening months of 1816 were to witness far more vehement protests. What, asked the opposition speakers, could be the meaning of these reviews, these parades? Why did the Regent open Parliament not, as was the custom, in civil dress, but in field marshal's uniform and cocked hat? Why was an entire district of London put into a state of siege whenever he gave an entertainment at Carlton House, kissing face, when the Earl of Essex and Lord Milton were stopped in Pall Mall by a horse guard who was standing sentry and obliged to turn back? They raised a discussion in both houses and declared the Constitution in danger. What, again, was the significance of so many new institutions, all infused with a novel spirit, institutions such as the Royal Military Asylum, which received the orphans of soldiers, and trained them from infancy for service in the army, in complete segregation from the civil population, the Royal Military College, where young men of good family were educated on the Prussian system, and the Military Club, composed exclusively of officers who wished, no doubt, to form a caste, to become a nation within the nation. But these complaints were as silly as they were noisy. The study already made of the military institutions of Great Britain is their sufficient refutation. In England the regular army was not of a nature to become the tool of royal despotism. It was not the army of an autocrat, but an aristocratic, anarchic, and decentralized army. Indeed, even those who denounced the new militarism did not venture to predict a coup d'état in the near future. Their sole complaint was that the increase in the staff put a larger number of places at the king's disposal, and thereby augmented, to use the stock phrase, the influence of the crown registered, but that influence was itself limited. Though abuses were rampant in the British army, they were not new. Neither King George, nor the Regent, nor the Duke of York was responsible for them. Like the abuses in all the other branches of the administration, they dated from the period of Whig rule. Far from strengthening, they paralysed the action of the government. A professional army, commanded by soldiers of fortune, may possibly endanger the stability of political institutions, but in England military and political institutions were in perfect harmony. The same men commanded the army and governed the state. It was by no means unusual for a country gentleman to purchase an ensign's or cornet's commission for his son, not that he might become a professional soldier, but that he might see life, might become a man of the world. Once the young man had attained the rank of lieutenant, he would leave the army, marry and settle down in his native county, there to perform those administrative functions which were his by right to all intents hereditary. Even those officers who aspired, and with success, to the higher ranks, saw with equanimity the final conclusion of peace. They knew that by right of birth they would find, either as county magistrates or as members of Parliament, places awaiting their occupation in the ranks of civil society. They were even prepared at need to acquiesce in a reduction of the forces. A new type of anti-militarism was now growing up, based entirely on economic, not, as formerly, on constitutional grounds. A large army cost dear, England was overburdened with taxation, and the officers who sat in Parliament, whether retired or active, mattered little, were landowners as well as soldiers. They desired the abolition of the income tax, and this involved a reduction of the army estimates. Attached more closely to their class than to their profession, they were thus rendered incapable of forming a distinct military party at Westminster. but without leaders the British Army could never become a Praetorian Guard, and conversely, even had the officers desired to employ the army to repress any movement that threatened the interests of the propertied classes, they would have needed soldiers willing to yield them blind obedience. There was, however, but little community of interest or sentiment between officers and privates. The army lacked esprit de corps. The common soldier, out of touch with his officers, and an object of distrust to the people, who regarded him either as an idle good-for-nothing living at their expense or as a particularly well-armed and dangerous policeman, lost, when confronted with a riot at home, the invincible confidence which he had displayed so often when fighting a foreign foe. When grave disturbances broke out in London in the February of 1815, there were soldiers who disobeyed orders and took part with the rioters. 1 In spite of a defective organization, the British Army had been victorious. Owing to that defective organization, the victories won by the British Army did not endanger the nation's traditional liberties. 19 There was certainly no reason of national security to prevent the English reducing their expenditure on the army. England had now no enemies to fear. After a war extending over more than a century, the power of France was at length broken. Carthage had conquered Rome. It was the triumph of British diplomacy under both its aspects. The maritime and the continental policy of England had alike proved successful. At sea, England enforced as a belligerent rights which the other nations considered tyrannical. The diplomatic representatives of Great Britain claimed for the ships of their nation the right to stop, search, seize, and bring into their ports the vessels of neutral powers, merely undertaking to release them later if it were proved to the satisfaction of an English jury that they were not enemies' ships in disguise, and allow them to retain their cargo, if it were also proved judicially that the cargo, like the vessel, was really neutral. England also claimed the right to establish fictitious blockades, and order her privateers to seize any neutral vessel whose destination was supposed to be one of the ports arbitrarily chosen, though their access was not actually being blocked by a single British vessel. The British Court of Admiralty pronounced that Great Britain, in virtue of her insular position, blockaded naturally all the Spanish and French ports. England claimed in addition the right to stop and search neutral vessels, not only merchantmen but, if necessary, even men of war, to discover whether there were any English deserters on board and to carry off presumed deserters, without any form of trial, to serve in the British Navy. The exercise of these rights was required by the naval supremacy to which Britain now aspired, a supremacy itself a condition of her very existence, for the time had arrived when her manufactures had exceeded her agriculture, and she was therefore compelled to obtain from abroad at least a considerable portion of her food supply. Foreign nations had protested again and again against the British claims, and with French encouragement and support had leagued together to withstand them. In the end, however, they found themselves compelled to submit. Without the British alliance they could not hope to shake off the far heavier yoke of Napoleonic despotism. At sea Great Britain claimed, and claimed successfully, absolute sovereignty. On land, however, the situation was reversed, and since all the nations of Europe, with the exception of Britain, were continental rather than maritime powers, the British government was able, with every show of truth, to pose before the other rulers of Europe as the disinterested arbiter of international justice. The policy of the British government was not, nor had been since 1792, one of annexation. It is true that the late war had extended the British colonial empire. In India, a British protectorate had been imposed upon the Sultan of Mysore, upon the Nizam, and upon the Maratha Confederation. The British troops had occupied Delhi, and over 90,000 square miles of territory had been annexed. Along the coast the territories of the three presidencies had been joined up. In the interior the East India Company was extending in all directions its supremacy and influence. Ceylon, the Cape, Mauritius, Santa Lucia, and Tobago were all new conquests in the Indian Ocean or in the West Indies. But we must not regard this growth of the empire as the result of a preconceived design. It was by mere chance, indeed almost reluctantly, that the British government had made all these conquests. The disasters of the American War had rendered the policy of colonial expansion so distasteful to the English that they had to Faucilla, du Blocus Maritime, p. 7. 96. Even abolished the Secretaryship of State for the colonies when Pitt introduced his India Bill to enlarge the control of the government over the East India Company. He expressly declared all projects of conquest in India repugnant to the wish, the honor, the policy of this nation. Later, indeed, to safeguard the factories on the coast of India from attacks by the French agents, first at Seringapatam, later on the Jumna, it was found necessary to dispatch military expeditions into the interior. When, however, a succession of wars followed, the Board of Control, the directors of the company, and political and financial circles generally, took alarm. Orders were sent to the Governor-General, Lord Wellesley, to conclude peace as soon as possible. He resigned, and a series of treaties, provisional compromises, were botched up with the Maratha chiefs. Or, again, consider the negotiations for peace with America. Though Great Britain would not yield an inch where her naval rights were concerned, she was prepared to abandon all claims to territorial aggrandizement. The United States were even permitted to thrust a wedge of their territory between Canada and New Brunswick. The Treaty of Paris left to France Martinique and Guadeloupe, with her fishing rights on the Newfoundland coast, and even her factories on the coast of India, on condition that no armies were kept there. Holland received back Java, Denmark all her colonies. Even the colonies that were not given up were not retained for the sake of territorial expansion. Like the Ionian Islands, Malta, and Gibraltar in Europe, these colonies were regarded by British statesmen simply as strategic centers, or naval stations. St. Helena, Simon's Bay, and Mauritius would enable British ships on the voyage to India to take in supplies of fresh water and fresh meat. England, however, had a large surplus population, more hands than she could employ, more mouths than she could feed. Surely, it was high time to organize emigration to the new colonies, or at least to some of them. Apart from the exceptional case of Australia, a penal colony to which English convicts were deported, the British government does not seem even to have thought as yet of the solution of the problem of overpopulation. 1 Even when in the near future a movement of emigration would take shape of itself, altogether apart from government intervention, the ministry would not behold it without anxiety. For the British colonists would naturally look to the mother country for help against enterprises of other colonizing nations, or attacks by the native races, and the home government was by no means disposed to pay for the military expeditions which the colonists would demand. The time would, moreover, come when the colonies would claim a right to self-government, a parliament and a responsible cabinet, and England had not forgotten the troubles occasioned by the constant disputes in the old colonies between the popular assembly and the council which represented the home government. Neither had she forgotten how she had lost the larger part of her North American colonies. To prevent a repetition of that disaster, the British government struggled to maintain as strict a control as possible over the newly acquired colonies. In the intention of the ministry, these colonies were never to be more than fortified positions under military control. No doubt the governing aristocracy profited from the extension of the colonial empire, where lucrative sinecures were plentiful, but that aristocracy was subject to the constant pressure of middle-class opinion, the opinion not only of manufacturers and merchants, but of the entire body of investors. The colonial sinecures were denounced like all other sinecures, and like them threatened with abolition. In short, despite so many naval victories, the England of 1815 showed no signs of imperialism. Still less did she entertain the desire to make conquests on the continent of Europe. The King of England was now once more King of Hanover, but the union of the two crowns was soon to cease, nor did his ministers allow the English sovereign to make use of the power of Britain in the interest of his German electorate. The British government claimed to play on the continent the part of an impartial mediator. Throughout the war England had interpreted her belligerent rights in the sense most favorable to the inhabitants of the country under invasion and most inconvenient to herself. She had never permitted her armies to live, like Napoleon's, at the expense of the country. They were either obliged to purchase with ready money the necessary provisions, or these were brought by sea at no slight cost. On the conclusion of peace, England intervened between the victors and the vanquished. In 1814 she had obtained the signature by the powers of a separate treaty with France that the French government might be reconstituted in time to be represented at the Congress of Vienna, and participate in the settlement of Europe. At Paris, both before and after the 100 Days, Wellington constituted himself the protector of the French whom he had conquered, and on their behalf opposed the brutality of the Prussian troops and the unreasonable demands of the Prussian diplomats. Not a soul in Europe, however, with the possible exception of a handful of liberal statesmen and publicists, showed any gratitude to England for her policy of arbitration. The impartiality put forward so ostentatiously by the English appeared somehow cold and unsympathetic. Brought face to face with the English, all the other peoples of Europe, Frenchmen and Spaniards, Latins, Teutons and Slavs, were conscious of a common bond. They felt that the wars which had divided them during the past 25 years were after all civil wars, and asked themselves by what right a foreign nation interfered in their quarrels, to lecture them on morals and statesmanship. The British troops were often disconcerted to find themselves the object of general dislike in the country they had just liberated, while with the process of time the memory of French rule was losing its bitterness. How to allay the obstinate suspicion of continental governments and peoples was a problem which embarrassed English diplomatists, and it was complicated by another problem. In England, as in no other European country, public opinion was alert and ready to criticize the actions of the government. England was the sole country in which, according to constitutional forms universally respected, the entire policy of Europe was the daily subject of a public debate. Though the Tories were in power, she remained par excellence the free country among the European nations. English diplomatists were at times able to profit by the pressure thus exerted upon them by public opinion. They could on occasion protract negotiations, and declare themselves powerless to come to any definite agreement until the matter had been referred to London, and they were assured of parliamentary support. In most cases, however, they found the control of public opinion a burden and a source of weakness. It made it difficult for them to arrive at the most suitable formula to define the new settlement of Europe. XE. Was it simply a question of restoring the state of Europe previous to 1792, of re-establishing on their thrones all the legitimate dynasties, and thus obliterating as completely as possible every memorial of the long period of revolutionary upheaval, of maintaining the mutual independence of the nations, and preserving intact the old political and religious traditions? Such was, indeed, the desire of the Allies in 1814 and 1815, but difficulties were raised in London. The anti-Jacobin party in England had been formed by a coalition of the Tories and the great majority of the Whigs. The political philosophy of the new coalition had been formulated by a Whig. According to Burke and his school, equality was synonymous with tyranny, aristocracy with freedom. A century after the death of Louis XIV, the British upper classes could still believe that in defending their privileges they were defending the liberties of the nation and the political freedom of Europe. English legitimism was a totally different thing from continental. In the train of the British armies the system of parliamentary government had spread throughout the whole of Western Europe. The national pride even of the Tories was flattered by the adoption in turn by Sicily, Spain, France, and Holland of constitutions modelled on that of Great Britain. 1 Certainly they found it difficult to believe that the peoples of the continent were worthy to receive, or even capable of understanding, institutions of such sovereign excellence. They considered the Sicilian constitution too oligarchic, the constitution of Cadiz too Jacobin, and feared that the French Parliament would prove but a clumsy imitation of the Parliament of Westminster. But if the awkwardness of continental attempts at parliamentary government inspired the English Tory with feelings of scornful condescension, the brutal despotism of the newly restored monarchs filled him with disgust and horror. It was in Spain that the British policy was most completely stultified. Ferdinand VII restored the Inquisition, abolished the Constitution, and imprisoned or executed the leading liberals, the very men who admired most fervently the fundamental principles of English political and social life. To re-establish his despotism, the Spanish king employed troops paid with British gold and led by British officers. The opposition at Westminster raised violent protests, and the ministry scarcely dared to defend their action. They were well aware their ambassador at Madrid had informed them of it, registered that every success of absolutism in the peninsula was so much loss to British influence. Already in 1815, before the time of Canning and the revolt of the Spanish colonies, an incompatibility of principle was evident between England and her allies of 1813. Scarcely 4 months after Waterloo, the rulers of the great continental powers asked the Prince Regent to sign the agreement known as the Holy Alliance. Lord Castlereagh, to whom the communication of their request had been entrusted, expressed his regret that he was compelled to lay before a British sovereign this piece of sublime mysticism and nonsense. After deliberation, the cabinet declared itself unable to advise the regent to give his adhesion. It was unconstitutional for the sovereign to conclude on his own responsibility an alliance with a foreign monarch. His power was confined to the ratification of a treaty concluded in due form, signed already by a plenipotentiary and to which the Great Seal had been affixed. 3. The foreign policy of the Tory government was confronted with fresh difficulties when it came to rearranging the map of Europe. An exact restoration of the territorial arrangements previous to 1792 did not present itself, even to the English cabinet, as a prudent policy. The galaxy of petty states in western Germany and northern Italy had long exposed Central Europe to French influence and invasion. If the balance of power in Europe were to be maintained, it was essential that a barrier must be erected of states sufficiently large to offer a serious resistance to France. In other words, that policy of territorial groups which Napoleon had employed in favor of France must now be employed against her. In agreement with the rest of Europe, Great Britain demanded that the Scheldt should be opened to free navigation, that Antwerp should be declared a free port, and that the Spanish Netherlands should form one kingdom with Holland. But when these objects had been secured, neither the British government nor the British public had any interest in bringing about the universal absorption of petty states by their more important neighbours. The indifference of Great Britain formed a striking contrast to the greed displayed by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Nor did the opposition speakers fail to exploit this indifference. They refused to recognize in the new states, artificially created by international diplomacy, the free countries, the collective persons which Britain had defended against Napoleon's aggression. In language of the most thoroughgoing conservatism, Mackintosh pronounced the panegyric of the ancient and magnificent system which had been bestowed on Europe by the Peace of Westphalia, and preserved intact until the partition of Poland and the French Revolution. He complained that, despite the overthrow of Napoleon, the Napoleonic system was still maintained, the sole difference being that the dictatorship of Europe, then wielded by a single man, was now in the hands of a triumvirate. The ministers questioned could find nothing to reply. Public opinion was first aroused by the Norwegian question. In virtue of an agreement concluded with England, Bernadotte had obtained as the price of his defection the separation of Norway from Denmark and its annexation to Sweden. The Norwegians thus delivered to a new master rose in arms. Had not the Swedes effected a speedy conquest of Norway, it is extremely doubtful whether Parliament would have permitted the British government to fulfill the terms of the treaty by giving active assistance to the Swedish army. The annexation of Genoa by Piedmont next kindled popular indignation, the more intense because Lord William Bentinck, the British plenipotentiary in Italy and a convinced Whig, had lavished on the Genoese the most solemn promises of liberty. 1 As regards Germany, the King of Prussia had concluded an agreement with his close ally, the Emperor of Russia, to divide the possessions of the King of Saxony, who to the very end had refused to join the Allies. According to the terms of this arrangement, Russia was to secure the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, Prussia, Saxony itself. This compact threw out of gear all the calculations of British diplomacy, for Great Britain had no desire to see this increase of Russian territory and influence. Was there not reason to fear lest the Tsar, now become so powerful by the downfall of France, would ally himself with the United States to defend the rights of neutrals at sea? Might he not cherish designs of conquest in Turkey, perhaps even in India? What the English cabinet would really have liked was a close alliance with Prussia and Austria, since these two powers formed a barrier between Western and Eastern Europe. Since this was impossible, the ministry was forced to be content with an agreement with France and Austria against Russia and Prussia. In the early months of 1815 a treaty of alliance was signed with the two former powers. A joint military demonstration, perhaps even an expedition, was expected, but further difficulties arose. In Italy Murat had succeeded in keeping his throne, with the support of Austria, which not only gave him a formal guarantee of undisturbed possession, but even promised him an increase of territory in the north. England and France, however, feared the possibility of a secret understanding between Murat at Naples and Napoleon in banishment at Elba, and desired the restoration of the Bourbons to the Neapolitan throne, as being at once clients of the British government and relations of Louis XVIII. Public opinion in London made use of all these questions of foreign policy, which threatened to cause a war at any moment, as pretexts to censure the cabinet. In January Lord Castlereagh, the English plenipotentiary at Vienna, was hurriedly recalled. A session of Parliament was about to open, the political situation was extremely difficult, and the ministry dared not face the debates unless Castlereagh were present in person to justify his diplomacy to the Commons. Was an outbreak of war really imminent during the early months of 1815? The British cabinet, at any rate, were most strongly opposed to war, and whenever Wellington at Paris, or Castlereagh at Vienna, displayed any inclination towards a war or even an offensive alliance, Lord Liverpool wrote from London to urge a more peaceful course. There is no mode, he wrote, in which the arrangements in Poland, Germany, and Italy can be settled consistently with the stipulations of the Treaty of Paris, which is not to be preferred, under present circumstances, to a renewal of hostilities between the continental powers. For any war that might break out in any part of Europe would very soon become general and kindle a revolution. At the close of 1814, Lord Liverpool still hoped that 2 or 3 years of peace would suffice to calm the excitement of popular feeling throughout Europe, and that diplomatists would then be able once more, without peril to the established order of society, to provoke a war, not different in its character and its effects from any of those wars which occurred in the 17th and 18th centuries, before the commencement of the French Revolution. The 100 Days shattered the illusion. All the rulers of Europe agreed with one consent to weaken France, to impose upon her a heavy indemnity, narrow her frontiers, and plant garrisons on her territory. All divergencies of interest were obliterated by the common dread of Napoleon. The peace of Europe was thus securely established. The epoch of dynastic wars had passed. Nor would even the democratic opposition demand a war to emancipate the peoples of Europe from the despotic rule of the League of Monarchs. In fact, the desire for a policy of peace and retrenchment was universal. The majority even of the ministerialists supported the opposition against the cabinet in their demand that the heavy burden of taxation should be alleviated. Such an alleviation was not, however, feasible so long as the British army was maintained on a war footing, and subsidies were paid to continental powers. Very few persons give themselves any anxiety, wrote Lord Liverpool on January 16 to Lord Castlereagh, about what is passing at Vienna, except in as far as it is connected with expense. Again, on February 2 he insists in an alarmist letter, many of our best friends think of nothing but the reduction of taxes and war establishments. The country at this moment is peace-mad. XXI. The preceding studies have abundantly proved that the constitution of the British government about the year 1815 must be regarded, despite the reactionary tendencies of the Tories, as genuinely free. We're to understand by this, in the first place, that the various branches of the administration constituted together a system of securities against bureaucratic centralization and military despotism, for their nature made it impossible for the head of the executive to employ a handful of bureaucrats to oppress the majority of his subjects. England was a nation richly provided with the means of war, but her principal arm of warfare was her navy, and no navy, however strong, can ever endanger public liberty. And although the English had reluctantly yielded to the pressure of circumstances and now maintained a large standing army, this host of mercenaries had neither the means nor the desire to seize the reins of government and alter the constitution. When, however, we say that Enoland was, in the sense above defined, a free country, we are far from terming it a democracy. Such a designation would be very far from the truth. To be sure, the British aristocracy was an open body, for it was constantly receiving new accessions from the bar, the army, and commerce. Nevertheless, it was substantially an aristocracy of wealthy landed proprietors, who controlled both the central and the local government of the country. Hence the progress of democratic institutions during the 19th century necessarily followed, in England, a course very different from that which it was to follow in the other European countries. On the continent the bureaucratic state was already in being, and nothing more was required than the transference to other hands of this pre-existent machinery and its employment for novel purposes. In England the machinery itself had to be created. Nevertheless, to term it aristocratic is not to describe adequately the English system of government. Though predominantly aristocratic, it was not undiluted aristocracy. We have already had occasion to remark the presence in the British Constitution of influences which counteracted the influence of the ruling aristocracy, for all its firm grasp of power and greedy appropriation of the prizes of government. The aim of the Whig campaign for the reform of administrative abuses which opened about the year 1780 was to deprive the Crown of one of the sources of its power and thereby to fortify indirectly the political privileges of the aristocracy. Since, however, it was that very aristocracy which profited so largely by these abuses, it lost at least as much as the monarchy lost by the progress of administrative reform. An external force, the pressure of public opinion, drove them forward and carried them further than they would ever have been led by motives of self-interest. Our study of the foreign policy of Great Britain has shown that English diplomatists and statesmen, because they had been nurtured in a tradition of self-government and were members of a ruling aristocracy, viewed with uneasiness the despotic tendencies of the continental monarchs. And it happened not infrequently in their dealings with the continental nations they found themselves compelled, by the pressure of public opinion, to show sympathy with a democratic policy by no means in harmony with the interest of their class. We have also seen how in the provinces the system of aristocratic self-government left public opinion a partial control over local government. For the landowners had at their disposal neither police nor military force to defend them against insurrection. To assure the permanence of the existing system, therefore, they were obliged to take account of views of those whom they governed. Nor is this all that can be said. The control exerted over the governors by the governed found further expression in a number of positive institutions, which formed part of the constitution of the kingdom. To these we have already made passing allusion, we must now undertake their detailed study. Chapter 2. The Legislature and the Supremacy of Public Opinion 0. Here are three, and only three, possible methods by which a people could govern itself. The entire body of citizens might meet as frequently as possible to pass laws and to nominate officials to execute them. This is government by public meeting, the direct government of the people by the people. Or a limited number of individuals might be designated by lot, or selected according to any kind of predetermined order according to seniority, if you like, for that would serve the purpose as well as anything else. Those chosen few would discharge in turn the functions of government. This is government by rotation. Or again, the entire body of citizens might assemble, at fairly distant intervals, not to legislate or appoint the executive, but to elect a certain number of representatives who, until the next election, would discharge with greater continuity the functions which, according to the first alternative, the popular assembly would have performed directly. This is representative government. All these three forms of government existed side by side in the British Constitution at the beginning of the 19th century. Direct government of the people by the people is adapted only to the elementary needs of very small communities. It is, Therefore, no matter for surprise that this form of government persisted in the meeting, whose president was a meadsman, a common herd, a fieldsman, or an overseer, and whose function it was to regulate the cultivation of the common land of the parish. 1. The meeting was perhaps the final relic of a constitution of society anterior to the feudal system. It was, moreover, a survival which lost constantly in importance, as the organization of society became more complicated, and was even on the way to vanish completely, since the avowed object of legislation was now to vest the ownership and cultivation of the soil entirely in the hands of individuals. But it is more surprising that the government of the parishes themselves, those small units of local government into which the whole of England is divided, was also of government by public. Webb, English Local Government, Volume 2, pages 128 SQQ. 108. Meeting. The parish was administered by 5 officials, who together constituted the parochial executive, the church wardens, the constable, the surveyor of highways, and the overseer of the poor, and by an assembly, the vestry meeting, a meeting of all those interested in the administration of the parish. This assembly exercised a control over the actions and the expenditure of the executive, and in certain cases nominated these officials, or at least took part in their nomination. The vestry, which owed its name to the fact that it met regularly in the vestry of the parish church, naturally played a very important part in the choice of the church wardens. These were partly secular, partly ecclesiastical officers, responsible both to the ordinary of the diocese and to the parochial meeting. While it was their duty to keep the church accounts, they also took part in the local police, and in the administration of the poor law. The vestry also drew up the list of substantial persons from which the magistrates selected the surveyors of highways. In the vast majority of rural or semi-rural parishes, the line of cleavage between those who paid the local rates, the farmers and shopkeepers, and the agricultural laborers who did not pay them, was sufficiently distinct to make it easy to exclude the latter from the vestry meeting. In these circumstances, the parochial assembly was composed of a small number of persons, who were usually, as tenants, dependent on the class from which the magistrates were taken. It is, nevertheless, highly significant of the limitations imposed upon the authority of the latter that they had always left to the small tenantry settled on their estates the right to share with themselves the administration of the local finances. In the large urban parishes, one of two things happened. In some places the great mass of ratepayers took no interest in local affairs and left their entire management in the hands of the parish officers, who were appointed by co-optation under the control, more or less effective, of the magistrates. A primitive form of democracy had degenerated into oligarchy. Elsewhere the inhabitants did not allow the rights of nomination and control, conferred upon them by immemorial custom, to fall thus into abeyance. Since, however, no written law or fixed precedent determined whether the right to take part in the vestry meeting belonged to all the inhabitants, or solely to the ratepayers, all attempts at distinction 1 Webb, OPCIT, Volume I, pages 61 SQQ. 109. Were abandoned when the ratepayers were counted by thousands and class distinctions had been obliterated. During the economic crisis which followed the restoration of peace in 1815, the inhabitants of several large towns were brought by skillful agitators to realize that it was in their power, by demanding a return to the traditional constitution of the vestry, to restore the annual control of the local budget to an assembly of all the inhabitants of the parish, perhaps even to invade prerogatives which the magistrates and their administrative subordinates had come to consider by every right their own. These petty local revolutions, which were now to take place here and there throughout the country, and against which the magistrates had no legal weapon, would so dismay the ruling class, that laws would be passed to facilitate the transformation of open into select vestries, that is to say, the substitution of a representative system for government by public meeting. Like the direct government of the people by the people, government by rotation, in which each of the governed is called in turn to discharge the functions of legislator or executive official, is adapted only to societies of very small size and rudimentary structure. It is not, therefore, Astonishing that this form of government persisted in certain institutions that were survivals from a primitive state of society. Take, for instance, the organization of the parish and the choice of the parochial officers. According to a very ancient tradition, which seems to have been regarded everywhere as possessing the force of law, in default of a special custom to the contrary, all the parishioners, or at least all the men of substance in the parish, discharged in rotation the functions of local government. Or take the ancient manorial institutions. The court baron and the court leet was essentially a jury discharging functions at once legislative, executive, and judicial. This jury was composed of at least 12 men of substance, chosen either by rotation or by lot. Or again consider the organization of the counties. The Court of Quarter Sessions was assisted by a grand jury, and this not only in the performance of its strictly judicial functions but even in its administrative capacity. Without a presentment of the jury, the assembled justices were unable even to order the necessary expenditure for the repair of a prison or of a bridge. England was a museum of constitutional archaeology where the relics of past ages accumulated. But the very mention of the word jury is sufficient to make us realize that in the British Constitution government by rotation was much more than a mere archaeological curiosity. There was a jury at the assizes alike in civil and in criminal cases. The jury system is, indeed, one of the fundamental institutions of English society. Historians derived its origin from the period of the Saxon kings. And it was, they asserted, to be found clearly formulated in Magna Carta. Once universal throughout the continent, it was only within the past century that it had been abolished in Sweden. In the near future it would be revived everywhere under the influence of the sole country which had been able to preserve its life and prestige unimpaired. In the eyes of Blackstone, trial by jury was the palladium of British freedom, the guarantee of its imperishability. If Athens, Carthage, and Rome had lost their liberty, it was due solely to the absence of the jury system. In civil cases the law provided that 12 jurors should be chosen by lot from a list made up for each session of the assizes, and containing from 48 to 72 names. Extensive rights of challenge were granted to the contending parties. Once constituted in due form, the 12 jurors heard the speeches of counsel, the evidence, and the judge's summing up. After this they retired into an adjoining room, where in order to avoid intemperance and causeless delay they were kept without meat, drink, fire, or candle, unless by permission of the judge, till they were all unanimously agreed. In criminal cases the law almost always demanded that before this jury of 12, the petty jury, entered upon its task, a grand jury of 24 members should have previously examined and preferred the indictment. And a further precaution was taken. The coroner, who inquired into cases of violent or sudden death, could conduct his inquest only as the precedent of a jury. The jurors were not, strictly speaking, judges, for here also the British lit. Constitution was true to its mixed character, and gave one part of the decision to professional magistrates who determined the question of law, the other part to the jurors who were called upon to determine the question of fact. But the line between fact and law was not always so easy to draw. A masterful judge would, in his summing up, put the question of fact to the jurors in language so skillfully manipulated as to leave the jury no real share in the final decision. An indolent judge would, on the contrary, contrive so to confuse the questions of law and fact as to throw as far as possible upon the jury the entire responsibility for the verdict. The war waged between the Crown and the press throughout the latter half of the 18th century turned entirely on this difficulty. Was the question before the jury whether the article incriminated was, or was not, in fact, libellous, or were they merely asked to decide whether the journalist accused was, as a matter of fact, the author of the article incriminated, the further question of its libellous character being a question of law and as such coming within the province of the judge? Finally Parliament intervened and settled the doubt in the sense most favourable to the pretensions of the jury. It is remarkable that throughout the debates the speakers of both parties vied with each other in their zeal to maintain the jurors' rights. Even during the period of anti-Jacobin reaction which followed, these rights were never the object of serious attack. Although Lord Eldon had no love for juries, he found himself obliged to praise them in his public speeches. Far from decaying, the institution spread. In 1815 it was extended to civil cases in Scotland. The jury system, and certain customs closely bound up with it, gave English trials an appearance which shocked the foreign visitor, accustomed, as he was, to the formality of continental courts. When the Westminster judges on circuit arrived at a county town, all the local society came to meet them. A season of festivities began for the county, in which the trials were an afternoon diversion. Everything, wrote the Frenchman Cottu, breathes a spirit of levity and mildness. The judge looks like a father in the midst of his family occupied in trying one of his children. His countenance has nothing threatening in it. According to an ancient custom, flowers are strewed upon his desk and upon the clerks. The sheriff and officers of the court wear each a nosegay. By a condescension sufficiently extraordinary, the judge permits his bench to be invaded by a throng of spectators, and thus finds himself surrounded by the prettiest women of the county, the sisters, wives, or daughters of grand jurors. They are attired in the most elegant negligee, and it is a spectacle not a little curious to see the judge's venerable head, loaded with a large wig, peering among the youthful female heads. The English were not always so enthusiastic. Edgeworth relates in his memoirs that at Oxford, where it was the custom of the undergraduates to invade the court and create a scene of incredible uproar, he was compelled to intervene to save a prisoner who merely in consequence of the din was on the verge of an unjust and illegal condemnation. It is, wrote another Englishman, rather too much to see the ladies putting on their bonnets in the morning, to look at the judges and hear the prisoners condemned to death, and then take them off again to prepare for the dance at night. One would not expect that they should return home to eat no dinner, but, without incurring the charge of any mawkish sentimentality, one may be permitted to feel something revolting in the very name of an assize ball. Objectionable or not, the custom reveals the real significance of the jury system, namely, that it is essentially trial per patrium, per paes, by the country, to use the traditional term. England desired the public to assist the judges in the administration of justice. Obviously professional judges would know the law better than judges picked up for the occasion, but would they have the same interest in protecting the rights of the subject? If they were permitted to dispense justice alone, what guarantees would the public possess against their cruelty, despotism, or pedantry? Trial by jury carried out the principle underlying all popular government control of efficiency by interest. Certainly we must not leave out of consideration the rules which determined the composition of the list out of which the jurors were chosen by lot. It was the sheriff, himself nominated by the king on the presentation of the magistrates, who drew up this list. Then was the time to eliminate all who did not belong to the governing aristocracy, and although the law prescribed no pecuniary qualification for members of the grand jury at the assizes, they were in fact always taken from the local gentry. Since this was the case, must not the jury system be reckoned among the institutions employed by the aristocracy to defend their position against encroachments of the crown officials, but unable to exercise any check on oppression by that aristocracy itself? We must beware of exaggeration. In the first place, what was true of the grand jury at the assizes was not true of the grand jury at quarter sessions. In the latter case, while the aristocracy judged, the grand jury was taken from the middle class. 2 And, again, what was true of the provinces, especially those genuinely rural, was not true of the great urban centers. There the landed aristocracy took no interest in public life, and abandoned judicial functions to the middle, even to the lower middle class. 2 And, further, what was true of the grand jury was not true of the petty jury. From members of the petty jury the law required only the freehold of property of land producing an annual income of at least £10 a year, or a life tenancy at a rent of at least would cost within £300, and annual subscriptions afterwards about £100 a year. Politics free. Of the extent to which the influence of the treasury and the great landowners diminished when the number of electors increased even slightly we can best judge from the example of Windsor, where at the very foot of the royal palace 300 electors returned in 1807 an independent candidate. We may now cross a considerable gulf to the third group. It consists of 8 constituencies where not only was the franchise democratic but the number of electors exceeded 1,000. This was the case in the 3 boroughs of New Shoreham, Cricklade, and Aylesbury. It was also the case in a certain number of large towns. Northampton had 1,300 voters, Leicester 2,000, Preston 2,100, Southwark 3,000, Westminster 17,000. Here elections were of practically the same character as the county elections, and were the field on which obstinate and ruinous contests were fought out between rival families. In these urban constituencies, however, a new class of society intervened in the contest: the manufacturers, who in the north of England had already begun to make enormous fortunes. They could rely on the assistance of the Treasury in a struggle against the great opposition families. It was with the aid of Lord Liverpool and of the Church and King Club at Manchester that the Horrockses carried one of the Preston seats against the Stanley family. 1. The names of Horrocks, Peel, and Arkwright, in fact the greatest names of the cotton industry, are to be found in 1815 among the supporters of the government. The interference in politics of these nouveaux riches increased the corruption of political life, and many of their contemporaries took alarm. Certain manufacturing towns, according to Thomas Gisborne, were so convinced of the gravity of the evil that they regarded the grant of parliamentary representation as a calamity. Wakefield deplored the facility with which businessmen purchased seats. According to him, such men exerted an influence hostile alike to virtue and freedom, for they were the authors of a system of treating and bribery which was the disgrace of English elections. But after all, the evil, though it gave scandal from its very novelty, was not in fact so very grave. In the first place, whatever the means they employed to get into Parliament, the presence in the House of this new industrial aristocracy redressed the excessive preponderance of the great landowners. Nor could these new men from the factories, however greedy of titles and social importance, sacrifice their economic interests to their ambition. When the Protectionist Corn Bill came under discussion and had obtained the approval of a large number of Whig landlords, Sir Robert Peel, a Tory member, energetically denounced the measure and voted against a ministry into which he was proud to have introduced his son. Moreover, as the number of electors multiplied, the cost of corruption became prohibitive. Thomas Babington, member for Leicester, and Henry Thornton, member for Southwark, were model members. Southwark had rejected tyranny the moment he accepted a lucrative sinecure. The gigantic constituency of Westminster had effected, during the last 10 years, nothing short of a revolution in the history of English parliamentary representation. After a century of violent and often ruinous contests, in 1788 his election had cost Lord Townshend £50,000. The two parties had agreed to share the seats. Though this agreement was economical, since it suppressed electoral contests, it involved the political annihilation of the constituency. In 1807 the electors revolted against it and returned Sir Francis Burdett, the popular candidate who was independent of both the traditional parties, without the expenditure of a single penny on his part. In 1812 other Democratic agitators, Hunt and Cartwright, came forward with the same program as Burdett. Though unlike him they failed to secure their return, nevertheless the English electorate was attaining an ever clearer consciousness of its independence. Many symptoms justified the hope of a sensible improvement in the conduct of elections even under the existing system. The price of boroughs had been lowered. 1 Many candidates refused to obtain a majority by wholesale purchase. The opposition papers remarked with pleasure that less cynicism was now displayed in preparing for an election, and more regard shown for decorum and respectability. For all their defects the constituencies which we have just described were the remnants of a democratic system of representation. The majority of English boroughs, however, still remain to be examined. In all these we shall find that by law or custom the franchise was considerably more restricted. V.B. There were 37 boroughs described as burgage or burgage tenure boroughs. The burgage was a feudal tenure, which imposed on the tenant the performance of certain fixed Services to the Lord of the Manor. In these burgage boroughs the number of voters was determined by the number of holdings, whether cultivated or uncultivated, occupied or unoccupied, whose tenure was a burgage tenure. If one single owner managed to gather into his hands all the burgage holdings, there was but one elector for the borough, which then became in the strictest sense of the term the property of an individual, a proprietary borough. No abuse of the English franchise was to be the object of such violent denunciation by the radical reformers of 1832 as the proprietary borough. None had been treated so leniently in Parliament during the last years of the 18th century. The more the great families who dominated Parliament declaimed against the corruption of the constituencies, since this was a weapon too frequently employed at their expense by the Treasury or by the nouveau riches, the more were they disposed to see in the burgage boroughs the solid support alike of their own power and the liberties of the nation. Nor must we forget that the number of these burgage boroughs, which it is tempting to regard as typical examples of the ancient system of representation, was extremely small. Moreover, before passing upon them an indiscriminate condemnation, we must first decide to what extent they really were the absolute property of an individual or family, and even when this was the case, what use was made of the property. Where the number of burgage holdings was very small, where they all belonged to a single owner, and where the law expressly gave the franchise not to the tenant but to the landlord of the burgage holding, the borough was in the strictest sense a close borough, and it was impossible to open it. Such was the proverbial borough of Old Sarum. The Earl of Caledon had bought from Lord Camelford the uninhabited estate on which had once stood a flourishing town. As owner of the 7 burgage holdings he nominated 2 members at a general election. 1 Where, however, the number of burgage holdings was larger, where they were divided among several owners, and where the franchise belonged not to the landlord but to the occupier, the borough at once ceased to be the exclusive property of an individual. At North Allerton, in Yorkshire, the landlord of a large number of houses to which burgage tenures were attached could preserve his right of nomination only by granting the tenants a rebate of £100 on every long lease. At Haslemere, the first Lord Lonsdale, the owner of 40 freeholds carrying with them the franchise, even brought 40 of his Northumberland miners to Surrey, lodged them, and paid them at the rate of 10s. 60 a week without exacting any service in return save a vote for his candidates. When in 1812 the second Lord Lonsdale, finding this procedure too costly, dismissed his professional electors, the seat was at once threatened. At Malton the proprietor, or rather the would-be proprietor, of the borough at one election lost one of the seats. The landlords had invented a number of fraudulent or semi-fraudulent devices to defend what they deemed their property. One of these was the creation of voters for the occasion, whose lease was purely fictitious, valid only for the period of the election. Another was the splitting of the freeholds to multiply the number of votes at the proprietor's disposal. 4 This gave rise to grievances and lawsuits, which might cost the parties concerned as much as £40,000 or even £60,000, thus even in the burgage boroughs the political privileges of the aristocracy were threatened. 3 Let us suppose, however, that in one of these boroughs the proprietor exercised in perfect security the right conferred upon him by custom. In what way, in what spirit, would he employ his parliamentary fief? Possibly as a source of pecuniary profit. For the last 40 years the honour of membership of the House of Commons had been more coveted than in the past, and it was now more common for the owners of boroughs to sell them to the highest bidder. The practice, however reprehensible, presented certain advantages. It might guarantee the independence of the new member against the patron's interference. It was for this reason that Sir Francis Burdett, the Democrat, bought in 1796 one of the seats for Boroughbridge from the Duke of Newcastle. But we must bear in mind that in England this boroughmongering was quite the exception. Wakefield, an impartial critic, testifies to a great difference in this respect between England and Ireland. The proprietors of boroughs were, indeed, he tells us, only too often disposed to this traffic, but such boroughmongers were held in very slight esteem and occupied a very low position in society. i.e. the majority of cases the owners of boroughs used their property for the profit of their family. Their political morality was the morality not of a merchant but the chief of a clan. A member of one of the great families who governed the English provinces regarded his intellect, his energy, and the influence at his disposal as due in the first instance to his family, and after that to the party to which his family belonged. Though the system was an oligarchy, it contained, nevertheless, representative and even democratic elements. At the opening of the 19th century a theory was evolved by the apologists of the existing system, according to which a member of parliament did not represent his own constituency, but joined with his fellow members to constitute the indivisible representation of the kingdom as a whole. This was the theory of virtual representation, which maintained that virtually, if not actually, the members who sat for Gatton or Old Sarum represented not only the phantom electors of these two boroughs, but also the Scott and Lot electors of Southwark and Westminster and the freeholders of the counties. Nor was this paradoxical plea on behalf of an unequal franchise without an element of truth. The representative of a close borough belonged from the day of his election to an aristocratic party which comprised not only the representatives of other close boroughs, but also members elected by open boroughs or counties. One with his party in all things, and under the control of a party leader, he yielded indirectly or virtually to the pressure exerted upon these by a wider electorate. Suppose him, for instance, a Tory, an advocate of war at any price, an opponent of Catholic emancipation. When he voted in this sense, he knew that he was not merely obeying the commands of a patron, but voiced the opinion of a very large section both of the borough and of the county electorate. Suppose him, on the contrary, a nominee of the Duke of Bedford or the Duke of Norfolk. He would then vote with the opposition, and demand a peace policy, even the reform of the representative system to which he owed his seat. In 1832 two proprietors of boroughs, Lord Fitzwilliam and Lord Radnor, were to form, with their clientele in the House of Commons, the backbone of the majority in favour of reform. Not only their relations, but also their dependants, were sent to Parliament by the proprietors of boroughs. After the 1812 elections, the great Whig families enabled the intellectuals of the party, defeated in the open boroughs, to re-enter Parliament by offering them the seats at their disposal. Pocket boroughs had at all times provided for clever youths who had left the universities and begun to show their capacity at the bar a means of entering Parliament without the risk or expense of an electoral campaign. For such men their first years in Parliament were often very difficult. Gratitude and self-interest alike kept them under the strict control of their political patrons. If they dared to speak or vote without orders from their patron, they might lose their seats, but their independence increased with the increase of their personal importance. In 1795 and in 1797 Abbott, the nominee of the Duke of Leeds, twice voted in support of important measures of which his patron disapproved. After a correspondence the Duke withdrew his censure of Abbott's conduct. In 1815 Francis Horner, although he owed his seat to Lord Grenville, dissociated himself from Lord Grenville's more conservative and bellicose party and voted with Lord Grey and Whitbread. He felt obliged to excuse himself and offer to resign his seat. The offer, however, was not accepted, and the hope was expressed that Horner would still adorn the group of Lord Grenville's friends with the prestige of his name. What is true of Abbott and of Horner is naturally even more true of a great man like Wilberforce. In 1811 Lord Calthorpe offered Wilberforce, who was tired of representing Yorkshire and in search of a quiet borough, his burgage borough of Bramber Point. For obviously he would not have dreamed of giving Wilberforce orders, but he was related to him, they belonged to the same party, and it would redound to his honour and his credit to have Wilberforce as the representative of his borough. 6. In the burgage boroughs the franchise was attached to the soil. In the boroughs, whose constitution remains to be studied, it was the privilege of a corporate body. Among these were boroughs in which the franchise was the sole property of the members of the corporation, the membership of which was recruited by co-optation. Elsewhere it was wider, and belonged to all the freemen of the borough, that is to say, to all the members of the guilds or companies. We find, therefore, two distinct electorates. Certain practices, however, tended to blur the distinction between them. Wherever the freemen possessed the franchise, it would appear to have belonged equally, whether by express statute or by immemorial custom, to the corporation, and where the practice was not expressly prohibited by law, the latter possessed the right to create an indefinite number of honorary freemen, and was able by this means to acquire a preponderating influence even in boroughs where all the freemen voted. The majority of English boroughs were either corporation or freeman boroughs. There were 36 of the former, 77 of the latter. Taken as a whole, these boroughs illustrate perfectly the complex character of the unreformed franchise in England, for in them we discover a host of divergent influences at work: the influence of the great landowner, of the wealthy merchant or manufacturer, of the treasury, and finally of independent public opinion. The 36 corporation boroughs were obviously those in which the electorate was most dependent. These tiny constituencies, where the voters often did not exceed 10 and very rarely rose above 100, were inevitably exposed to illicit pressure, and the poorer the voters, the more incapable they would be of resisting it. Among the 1,000 inhabitants of the small borough of Malmesbury were bankers, solicitors, and merchants, who would have conferred the desirable respectability on the corporation had they been members of it. On the contrary, of the 13 members of the corporation there had been quite recently 10 incapable of signing an official document. For these illiterates, the franchise was not a weapon for the defense of reputable interests, but simply a means of gaining money at intervals without having to do any work for it. The electorate of these corporation boroughs, like that of the smaller Scott and Lot boroughs, was subject to the influence of the landed aristocracy, for the electors were, as a rule, tenants of the great landowners of the district. They were not, however, prepared to give their vote for nothing. A solicitor, as at Andover, Bewdley, and Devizes, or a chemist as at Malmesbury, acted as their agent and in their name offered the 2 borough seats at a fixed price to anyone willing to conclude the bargain. The government did not fail to take advantage of this traffic, and it is perhaps to this group that the greatest number of boroughs belonged which were termed Treasury or Admiralty boroughs, because the government had bought the votes of the corporation or packed the corporation itself with its paid clients. It was in vain that the law forbade public officials to vote. Their fathers, brothers, and sons could always exercise the franchise, might indeed be members of the corporation, and would then take care that vacancies were filled by men agreeable to the government. Where, on the other hand, the corporation was composed not of an ignorant and irresponsible rabble but of the leading men of the neighborhood, this was often in itself sufficient to emancipate the corporation borough from servitude of any kind, whether to the aristocracy or to the government. The borough of Calne in Wiltshire did not possess above 17 voters, all members of the corporation, and for 40 years Lord Lansdowne's patronage had been accepted without demur. But in 1807 he had tried in vain to compel the corporation to get rid of Mr. Jekyll, one of the retiring members. It had stood firm and Mr. Jekyll had been re-elected free of cost in opposition to Lord Lansdowne's wishes. The borough of Portsmouth contained, with the suburb of Portsea, 33,000 inhabitants, of whom 3,000 were employed in the Admiralty dockyards. Only the members of the corporation, the mayor, the aldermen, and the burgesses, 110 in all, possessed a vote. During the greater part of the 18th century the borough had been an Admiralty borough. In 1780, however, the corporation had rebelled. For a long time the numerical strength of the parties remained almost equal. Finally the government was defeated in the first naval port of the realm *. The 77 boroughs where the franchise belonged to the freemen presented a great diversity of character, and it would seem at first sight, from the extreme variability in the number of the electorate, in some places insignificant, in others considerable, that they must have resembled very closely the Scott and Lot boroughs. Their constitution was not, however, quite the same, and the part played by corruption was probably somewhat greater. In these boroughs the enjoyment of the franchise was determined not by a property qualification either high or low, but by the accident of an ancient municipal constitution. It might happen, as at Liverpool and in the City of London, that the franchise belonged to the poor, to the exclusion of the rich. Such a plebeian electorate often lacked the necessary independence. The opposition complained, for instance, in 1812 that Brougham's defeat at Liverpool had been caused by the labourers voting in gangs in obedience to the orders of the important electors of the locality. Nor were the voters necessarily denizens of the place. Hereditary freemen did not lose their franchise by living away from the borough. The candidate in need of their votes had therefore to seek them out and convey them to the poll at his expense. He had to pay them 6s. a day for their travelling expenses, 7s. 6d for their maintenance, tos. 6d to cover any losses incurred. It would therefore cost 10 to bring a voter from London to Colchester, £15 to bring him from London to Bristol, £20 from London to Exeter, £30 from London to Newcastle on Tyne. A contested election at Barnstaple, in Devonshire, cost from £10,000 to £13,000, since the voters were scattered throughout the entire realm. And finally, the power possessed by the corporation to create honorary freemen falsified an election still further. A candidate who felt doubtful of his popularity among the freemen, and did not consider himself in a position to spend the sums necessary to secure it, would betake himself to the corporation and obtain from that body the creation of a sufficient number of honorary freemen to swamp the hostile majority. At Carlisle there were 700 electors, and the popular candidates were the Duke of Norfolk's nominees. But Lord Lonsdale was master of the corporation. At his instance it conferred the honorary freedom upon 14,000 of his coal miners, and on 3 occasions his candidates thus secured election. We have found the same abuses universally prevalent, though perhaps graver in these boroughs than elsewhere. Everywhere, on the other hand, we remark the same variety, perhaps more accentuated in freeman boroughs than in others. If there were 9 of these with less than 20 electors, there were 20 in which the electorate ranged from 500 to 1,000,4 and 22 in which it exceeded 1,000. Bristol counted 6,000 electors, the City of London 17,000. The 9 boroughs where the number of electors was infinitesimal are instances of degeneration from the normal type. In these, to the advantage of the local patrons, the franchise was in practice confined to the members of the corporation, but immediately the number of electors ceased to be insignificant, the influence of the aristocracy was weakened. At Chipping Wickham there were only 50 electors. Nevertheless, 20 years before our period, Sir John Dashwood had won from Lord Lansdowne the seat which he had been accustomed to regard as his property. 1 When the number of electors exceeded 500, and a fortiori 1,000, the electorate began to assert its independence. Even in the large towns the ancient families still retained much of their influence. It was because they were prepared to make the necessary concessions to popular demands, or discover points on which their sentiments were the same as the voters. The Duke of Norfolk, for example, remained the patron of the borough of Gloucester, where 3,000 freemen exercised the franchise, because he had succeeded in winning the people's confidence by his constant largesses and the firmness of his political conduct. The scandals which took place at a Bristol election were doubtless disgraceful, but they cannot be ascribed to corruption by the government or wealthy individuals. Bristol was governed by 2 clubs, 2 caucuses, we should call them today, one Whig, the other Tory. Sometimes these agreed to divide the seats amicably. At others they contested them with a bitter animosity which knew no scruples in the choice of weapons. In other words, Bristol was already, under the unreformed franchise, a demagogue-ridden city, and the growth of democracy by no means tended to cure the evils from which it was suffering. In London, Waitman, a draper, the shopkeeper's candidate, when defeated in the 1812 elections, complained, and his complaint was echoed by the opposition journals, that the establishment of the excise offices and the Bank of England in the heart of the city, the introduction of an armed force for their protection, and the growing importance of the offices of the Customs and the East India Company, had increased the influence of the government registered, but obviously no extension of the suffrage could abolish an influence which took this form. Like Nottingham, where the artisans ruled the constituency. Norwich, Newcastle, and Coventry, both Bristol and the City of London, were independent and popular constituencies. VU. The abuses of the English system of representation were undoubtedly many and grave, but it is surely impossible to pass a general judgment upon a system so extremely complicated. Are we in a position to estimate the exact degree in which the nature of the parliamentary franchise stultified the operation of the representative principle and prevented public opinion from finding expression in Parliament? In 1817 Oldfield attempted to compile statistics on this point. According to his estimate, of the 405 representatives of the English boroughs, 14 were returned to Westminster not by the free choice of the electorate of their respective constituencies, but because their seats were in the patronage of the government. This figure is in our opinion too high, but even were it correct, it is obvious that the interference of the executive in the English representative system was after all trifling. It was by no means the same with the aristocratic influences. According to Oldfield, 197 representatives, or rather so-called representatives, of the English boroughs were the arbitrary choice of a certain number of local patrons, themselves members of the House of Lords or the House of Commons, and belonging as a general rule to the governing aristocracy. In the case of another 119 boroughs, although there was no nomination by a patron in the strict sense, his influence was the decisive factor in determining elections. But what after all is the real worth of this division of the English boroughs into 3 watertight compartments? It is founded surely on a false principle. From the nomination borough to that in which there was nothing more than a dominant influence, and from that again to a popular borough, there was an imperceptible transition. Even the boroughs classified by Oldfield as nomination boroughs were by no means always a property of which the assured possession passed down in a family from father to son without need of effort for its preservation. In very many cases constant attention and almost infinite outlay was essential if the electoral fief were not to be lost. An important rival family, a nabob returned from India with an enormous fortune, a local banker, a wealthy manufacturer, might at any time, if the proprietor were not willing to sell his electoral interest for ready money, declare war upon him, by the voters, and outbid the patron, until the day came when the new patron would be threatened in his turn by the operation of the same factors. Thus the very corruption of the electorate corrected to some extent the vices of the system, and afforded a means by which new classes of society could obtain seats in Parliament and the representation of their interests in the House. Over 50 bankers, merchants, and businessmen of all kinds, were members of the House of Commons in 1818. Some of these had already founded parliamentary families. Sir Robert Peel had begun to purchase the patronage of the borough of Tamworth, one of whose seats he occupied. For his 2 sons he bought 2 other seats. The banker Robert Smith, now Lord Carrington, had become the owner of 2 nomination boroughs. Of the 4 seats for these 2 boroughs, 3 were occupied by his near relatives. But even electoral corruption had its limits. In 1806 Major Cartwright had asked the electors of Boston what guarantee they possessed with a House of Commons elected under such scandalous conditions that Bonaparte would not purchase seats and obtain agents at Westminster. In reality no such thing ever happened. The days of Louis XIV and the Stuarts had passed, and English electioneering agents could be bought only with English money. And no sooner did the electors exceed a mere handful than aspirations after independence, hard to repress, began to show themselves. Certainly the electorate comprised but a very small fraction of the nation. The Society of the Friends of the People, founded to promote parliamentary reform, estimated in 1793 that 51 English and Welsh boroughs, whose total electorate was under I00, sent I00 representatives to Westminster, and that 11,075 English and Welsh electors, who belonged to a certain number of boroughs carefully chosen, elected 257 members of Parliament. Nevertheless, the representation of the counties was undoubtedly of a very popular character. Anyone prepared to buy a 40s hilling freehold could obtain a vote. In the boroughs the system was not so democratic, but several disadvantages attaching to a system of pecuniary qualification were absent. The law fixed no definite sum to qualify for the franchise, thus disfranchising all whose wealth fell below that figure. The borough electorate consisted of 100,000 individuals, the haphazard selection of customs varying in different localities, and drawn indiscriminately from every class in the nation: aristocrats and men of the people, rich and poor, members of the middle class and the proletariat. In 1815 many European nations were contemplating the adoption of the British parliamentary system. Not a single one would have dared to admit so wide an electorate. Considerable time and peculiarly favorable circumstances would be needed before representative government could become in continental countries what it was in the England of 1815, a hallowed tradition, part and parcel of the national heritage. All civilized governments, wrote the Edinburgh Review in 1807, may be divided into free and arbitrary, or, more accurately, into the government of England, and the other European governments. These words of the Edinburgh Review, written in 1807, could still have been written in 1815, even after the fall of Napoleon's empire. Obviously the system was in need of reform, and public opinion had already begun to press for it. The south of England was overrepresented, while the north lacked adequate representation. The agricultural interest was too strongly entrenched, while the industrial interest was insufficiently safeguarded. The list of boroughs needed revision and the number of electors might very well have been increased. The important question, however, was whether the electorate as constituted in the opening years of the 19th century would oppose an obstinate resistance to the demands of a new era and a transformed civilization. 15 years hence would come the decisive test. Twice in succession a House of Commons, elected under the franchise described above, would vote the reform of that very franchise and would force the reform upon the House of Lords. This proves that, unlike the House of Lords, the unreformed House of Commons already represented to a large extent the opinion of the country. It proves also that normally and constantly it was subject to the pressure of certain external forces whose character must now be determined. The first of these forces was rebellion, whether actual or merely potential, effectively carried out or simply threatened. Throughout the 18th century England, the sole European country where the reigning dynasty had been set up as the result of a successful rebellion, had been the home of insurrection. There had been an outbreak of anti-Jewish rioting in 1753, when the government had decided to grant the right of naturalization to the Jews domiciled in England. The cabinet had yielded and repealed the statute. Extremely characteristic of English conditions was the speech in which Lord Hardwicke defended the policy of the cabinet, as the sole policy possible where a nation is governed by public opinion. However much, he had said, the people may be misled, yet in a free country I do not think an unpopular measure ought to be obstinately persisted in. We should treat the people as a skillful and humane physician would treat his patient. If the nauseate the salutary draught we have prescribed, we should tea of some other remedy, or we should delay administering the prescription till time or change of circumstances has removed the nausea. In 1768 there were riots against the government. The popular hero Wilkes triumphed in Sn End over the opposition of court and cabinet. In 1780 an anti-Catholic riot broke out. During 4 entire days the centre of London was given up to pillage. A government without a police force was powerless either to prevent these outrages or repress them promptly. The right to riot, or as it was termed by the lawyers the right of resistance, was an integral part of the national traditions. In vain does Blackstone, in one of the most embarrassed passages of his commentaries, do his best to get rid of this right. He affirms that the king is, and ought to be, absolute, but he adds in the exertion of lawful prerogative, and he explains this to mean so far absolute that there is no legal authority that can either delay or resist him. He denounces the overzealous republicans who would grant to every individual the right of determining whether or no it is necessary to have recourse to resistance and of employing private force to resist even private oppression. He does not, however, contest that there were extraordinary cases, where the first principles of society must be directly applied. Such would arise inevitably when the contracts of society are in danger of dissolution, and the law proves too weak a defense. 148. Against the violence of fraud or oppression. 1. But the stream of history had changed its course during the last 20 years. It was now no longer England as in the 17th century, but France, which had witnessed a popular revolution, the decapitation of a king, a military dictatorship, a royalist restoration. In Western Europe, France had succeeded England as the typical country of rebellion. Nevertheless, despite the anxiety aroused by the events in France, the English remained faithful to their traditional creed. The orators and writers of the opposition continued to maintain that the English people possessed a right of resistance in the last resort. Fox, Grey, and Sheridan insisted upon this, even at the very height of the Jacobin scare. The Edinburgh Review was never weary of harping on this theme. The sole check, declared this organ, to the encroachments of power, and the oppressions of inceptive tyranny, is the spirit, the intelligence, the vigilance, the prepared resistance, of the people. The great and ultimate barrier against corruption, oppression, and arbitrary power must always be raised on public opinion, and on opinion so valued and so asserted as to point resolutely to resistance, if it be once insulted or set at defiance. Nor should we regard this merely as the assertion of an abstract and theoretical right. From 1810 to 1815, both in London and in the provinces, rioting had been the order of the day. In 1810 a riot broke out against Parliament itself. To maintain order, the government had been obliged to bring up in haste to the capital an army of 50,000 men. In 1812 a regular jacquerie broke out, which spread over the manufacturing districts of the Midlands, Yorkshire, and Lancashire. And the February of 1815 witnessed a grave outbreak of rioting, directed against the Act of Agrarian Protection, whose clauses were being hastily passed through Parliament. The riots of 1812 had been merely the revolt of misery and want, the incoherent rising of a disorganized and leaderless rabble, which immediately united against it all the wealthy and ruling classes. The riots of 1815, on the other hand, were tolerated, encouraged, even perhaps directed, by leaders of industry, bankers, and stock brokers, who were bitterly hostile to the policy of the landowners and agriculturalists. Parliament was besieged by the crowd, and the houses of the principal leaders of the party in office were pillaged. We may wonder what would have been the result of this popular agitation had not the return of Napoleon from Elba suddenly changed the current of feeling and saved the cause of order. But even this did not put an end to the manifestations against the government and the open-air meetings. On June 16, on the very eve of Waterloo, Lord Castlereagh, riding through Whitehall, encountered a meeting unauthorized by the local authorities at which the leaders of the popular party were haranguing the crowd. He was recognized, insulted, and followed through the Horse Guards to St. James's Park. That evening he thought it prudent to guard his house with troops. 1 In a few days' time, the peace of Europe was re-established, but the misery and discontent which had occasioned the risings of 1812 and 1815 did not disappear. Everyone in government circles foresaw a general insurrection, all the more dangerous that it could no longer be diverted by foreign warfare. Nor were even these sporadic manifestations of public opinion required to keep the ruling classes constantly sensible of the possibility and danger of a popular rising. The proceedings at an election were a periodical reminder both to the newly elected members and their noble patrons that riot belonged to the English political tradition. In virtue of all unwritten law universally respected, the mass of inhabitants, voters and non-voters alike, played a very active part on polling days, when the rival candidates met face to face. The nomination day was equally a day of popular demonstrations. The candidates owed their constituents a speech, a declaration of their political principles, and the crowd flocked to hear them, to approve or disapprove, according to circumstances. In boroughs where the franchise was the monopoly of a small number of burgage holders or burgesses, and where the remainder of the inhabitants considered themselves robbed of their ancient civic rights by the tiny group of electors, they would often seize the opportunity of an election to pave the way by a noisy manifestation for a petition demanding from Parliament the enlargement of the franchise in their constituency. When, however, an election was contested, popular excitement knew no bounds. A French writer who 0. visited England in 1818 and was present at an election declared himself unable to understand these Westminster mountebanks addressing a worthless rabble of whom not a man would vote for them. There is, he wrote, an entire absence of dignity and greatness. It was all mean parody and wretched farce. On the following page he describes the riot which broke out on the defeat of the popular candidate. The successful candidates were obliged by custom to ride in procession. They were immediately pelted with filth, greeted with a shower of thick and black mud. Saw Lord Nugent with one side all black. Lord Molyneux's face resembled a pug's. Lord John Russell attempted with difficulty to wipe off the stinking patches of dirt which continually bespattered his cheeks. One of the servants received so violent a blow on the head with a stick that he fell from his horse unconscious. Some had their windows broken and their furniture damaged. The houses of Lord Castlereagh and several others met with the same fate. The constables were insufficient to restore order, and the troops had to be called out. Such scenes shocked a visitor from the continent, but they had long been familiar to the English public. This tradition of rowdyism, however, did not lack its English critics. Even members of the Whig opposition complained of it as enabling a wealthy candidate, who distributed money by handfuls and treated on a large scale, to acquire a base popularity which corrupted public morals. Romilly, a typical Whig theorist, consented only with great difficulty to prepare for his candidature in 1812 by an electioneering campaign of the customary type, and openly showed the disgust he felt at the reception, though of a triumphal nature, accorded to him by the populace of Bristol. On the other hand, these rowdy customs found defenders in the Tory ranks. A Tory speaker protested in Parliament against the desire shown by certain reformers for a filtering stone to clear away all the mud of poverty, vulgar mirth, etc., from popular elections. Cockades, he continued, and the liberty of Hussein, were things which every Englishman admired. They contributed to give him an idea of the rights he enjoyed and on the possession of which he prized himself. This right of noisy and disorderly demonstration during an election was an integral part of the old English system. The seat was being contested by two candidates who both belonged to the same class of society. The electors would vote for the candidate who had managed to make himself the more popular, who had shown the greater zeal and efficiency in organizing those periodical Saturnalia of which Johnston speaks. The great political carnival which the common people regarded as their right. Even if we take into consideration the material advantages which the candidates might derive from victory at the polls, the enormous sums swallowed up in one election often exceeded all reasonable bounds. They are explicable only when the electoral contests are seen for what they were: a national sport, as popular, indeed more popular than horse racing. The rich incurred the expense for their own pleasure and the people's pleasure, and the passion they put into the contest was a form of the gambling mania. Though the system was illogical and anarchic, it was free and popular. Just as the democratic nature of the constituencies with an extended franchise compensated for the oligarchy of the burgage and corporation boroughs, so the license enjoyed by the populace at elections balanced the aristocratic composition of the House of Commons. The members of the aristocracy were compelled to come into personal contact with the masses, solicit their favor, possibly incur their anger. After the repeated reforms to be effected in the British franchise in the course of the 19th century, this counterpoise would no longer be so necessary, and the part played in elections by the mob was destined to vanish, as Parliament became more truly representative of the people. 9. The threat of rebellion was the first weapon wielded by public opinion to overawe the government in office and even the House of Commons. And the popular electioneering demonstrations may be considered an attenuated form of rebellion. But by the British Constitution the public possessed other and more legal methods by which to remind the ruling classes of its existence and intervene in parliamentary disputes. Blackstone lays down that in cases where a right has been violated, and the regular course of justice is powerless to redress the violation, every subject possesses a further right, the right to address a petition to the king, or to one or other of the two houses, for the redress of the wrong inflicted on the petitioner. But this right to petition involves the right of private persons to meet in order jointly to prepare and sign the statement of their grievances. It involves, moreover, the right to meet for deliberation on the opportune moment to present a petition. In this way the people were led to believe that they had a right to form permanent associations to maintain the defense of their interests. The right of petition, the right of public meeting, the right of association were rights of the subject, recognized as such by the executive and the legislature. This recognition was, however, by no means unconditional. The 18th century Whigs, to protect themselves against a Tory reaction, had put serious restrictions upon the right of meeting. The Riot Act, passed in 1714 as the permanent law of the land, conferred upon a single justice of the peace authority to disperse after a delay of 1 hour any meeting of at least 12 persons unlawfully assembled together, to the disturbance of the public peace. And the statute indemnified the magistrate in advance, should his efforts to disperse the crowd involve any deaths. Blackstone considered this measure as sufficiently important to counterbalance, in conjunction with the establishment of a standing army and the increase of the national debt, all the measures adopted in 1688 to limit the royal prerogative. Nevertheless, individuals arrested by order of a magistrate in execution of the Riot Act were secured from the possibility of arbitrary imprisonment or condemnation. In virtue of the Habeas Corpus Act they were entitled to demand an immediate trial in a regular court, where the judge was assisted by a jury. But during the last 20 years the right of meeting and the right of association had been the object of more serious attacks. The French Revolution had been echoed in England by a democratic agitation in 1792. The ruling classes had taken fright and passed a series of very severe statutes to repress the movement. A succession of Acts of Parliament had suspended temporarily the operation of the Habeas Corpus Act. In 1795 an act had been passed dealing with seditious meetings and assemblies, to be enforced during the 3 following years. For any meeting of more than 50 persons notice had first to be given to 3 justices of the peace. Any magistrate was empowered to break up with the help of the troops any meeting which had not complied with this formality, and even when a meeting was itself in order, a magistrate might dissolve it if in his opinion the speeches were tending to arouse among the people hatred or contempt of the king, the government, or the constitution. Any breach of these provisions was punishable with death. By this statute the right of public meeting was made subject to the discretion of the local bench of magistrates, and further provisions of the Act restricted even freedom of association. Societies holding regular political discussions in premises not open to the general public must obtain in future the magistrates' preliminary authorization and were submitted to their constant supervision. When the Act of 1795 expired in 1799, a new act imposed fresh restrictions upon freedom of association. 5 important societies were suppressed, and all societies which required their members to take an oath unrecognized by the law were declared to be ipso facto illegal, as also were all federations of societies. The penalty imposed for breach of these provisions was transportation for 7 years. And to this act directed against political associations, another was added against combinations of workmen and trade unions. It prohibited unions formed for the purpose of obtaining higher wages, and empowered the magistrates to condemn summarily all infractions of the Act. This Combination Act, originally passed in 1799 as a temporary measure, was made permanent in 1800 in a slightly modified form. 1 Thus at the very time, when on the other side of the Channel the Jacobin Republic was nearing its close, in England an entire code was being drawn up against the right of public meeting and the right of association. What measure of success attended this legislation? The statute prohibiting trade unions was to a large extent inoperative, and, in default of an efficient police, English statesmen were, as a rule, indisposed to embark on a contest with the unions, whose issue might have been humiliating for the government. Moreover, the freedom of religious associations remained unimpaired, and the penal laws formerly enacted against Catholics were either repealed or applied with an ever-increasing laxity. The Methodist sects prospered, their open-air meetings multiplied, and their organization received the explicit sanction of law. But our present concern is neither with the religious nor with the economic life of the nation. Our present concern is to determine the extent to which the political life of the country had suffered from the three statutes above mentioned. Though the propaganda carried on by the democratic associations underwent a temporary decline, it had given proof of renewed vitality during the last decade. Towards the close of 1806, the Middlesex Club had been founded in London, whose members, numbering about 300, paid an entrance fee of 1 guinea and an annual subscription of half a guinea. The object of this club was to purify political life, emancipate it from the twofold influence of wealth and social rank, and secure the return of democratic candidates, without the labor and ruinous expense of an electoral campaign. Societies similar in character were formed at Bristol and Westminster. These societies, to which the provisions of the law did not apply, as they were neither secret nor combined into a wider group, were the germ of the future democratic organization of the great political parties. About the same date the aged Major Cartwright revived the propaganda on behalf of universal suffrage, and under his influence were founded throughout the country the Society of the Friends of Parliamentary Reform, the Hampton Club, and the Union Society. From 1812 to 1814 the Luddite associations were spreading disorder through the manufacturing districts of Yorkshire, Cheshire, and Lancashire. The Cabinet, not content with employing against them the existing statutes, obtained from Parliament a further measure of repression. To be sure, the societies for political propaganda organized by Cartwright were as peaceable and as harmless as their head. And the Luddite associations were rather unions of workmen than political associations. Without political creed or program, their aim was the destruction of machinery and factories, not a political revolution. It was, nevertheless, impossible to regard the future without apprehension, and it was easy to foresee the day when the two forms of agitation would unite, and the government be faced with a revolutionary movement far more dangerous than the Jacobin movement of 1795. Against the venerable English tradition of popular disorder, the Tory reaction was helpless. It was, in fact, impossible to abolish freedom of association without at the same time abolishing freedom of meeting. But King George's ministers had never been able to effect the complete abolition of the latter. The county meetings were a regular institution, in many respects conservative, enjoying the consecration of custom. They were specially exempted by the Act of 1795 from the operation of the new statute. The summons to attend was issued by the sheriff. It was the custom that only the freehold electors of the county took part in the meeting. It was concluded by the adoption of an address drawn up by the local authorities in accordance with a solemn and traditional formula. The matter of the address was regularly an expression of loyalty to the sovereign. But although the presence of the sheriff and the exclusion from the meeting of all the inhabitants of the county not on the list of voters were considered obligatory, these restrictions were not based on any written law. In 1780 the Duke of Richmond in Sussex had neglected to observe the former point 1, and more recently the independent gentlemen of Cornwall had violated both. Certain counties, for instance Middlesex, were vast urban democracies, where a county aristocracy did not even exist. In other places the aristocracy was split into rival factions which at times did not shrink from imparting an almost revolutionary character to their quarrels. In 1805 and in 1807 county meetings had denounced the scandals in high places, had demanded the impeachment of Lord Melville, and the retirement of the Duke of York. In 1815 they called upon the ministry to abolish the property tax. It was clearly impossible to draw any definite line of demarcation between the county meeting held according to legal forms and the popular meeting which the Tory legislator desired to prohibit. During the last few years the English had been making a constantly increasing use of the right of meeting, as also of the right of petition inseparable from it. The right of petition had been affirmed by the Bill of Rights of 1688. In virtue of the statute, every British subject possessed the right to address a petition to the King and the two Houses. An act passed after the Restoration had, it is true, imposed certain restrictions upon the exercise of this right, had made the presentation of a petition by a gathering of more than 10 persons illegal, and enacted that every petition signed by more than 20 persons whose object was an alteration of the established institutions must have received the signature either of 3 magistrates or the majority of a grand jury. But although Blackstone considered the statute as still in force, and expressed his approval of it, for no one thought of applying it except in one exceptionally true blues year, during the anti-Catholic riots of 1780. When in 1795 William Pitt introduced his bill to repress seditious meetings, he expressly disclaimed any intention to interfere with the right of petition. The right, therefore, throughout the whole period of the Tory reaction remained at the disposition of the public, a means of bringing peaceful pressure from outside to bear upon the legislature, and preventing Parliament from passing statutes without regard to public opinion. A member of Parliament considered himself obliged to present to the House of Commons any petition signed in his constituency, even when he disagreed with its object. 1. Those who did not possess the franchise could sign a petition, and could thus take an indirect part in public life and warn the government that if no regard were paid to their wishes, a discontent would be aroused which might easily assume a form dangerous to the public peace. The opponents of the slave trade were first to make a systematic use of the right of petition. Their magnificently organized agitation had obtained a decisive victory in 1806. Collective petitions were henceforward the order of the day. In 1812 Brougham had secured the revocation of the orders in council by organizing petitions on a large scale, and the agitation of 1814 which followed immediately the restoration of peace, and whose object was to protest against the obstacles which Parliament desired to impose upon the importation of foreign corn, also took this form. Petitions to this effect had already been circulated in Glasgow in 1813, and it was in Glasgow that the movement was renewed in the following year. Thence it reached Lancashire and quickly spread throughout the length and breadth of England. Mr. Prothero, a Whig member for Bristol, collected 22,445 signatures in his constituency. In 5 days 20,000 were brought to Leeds. All, or almost all, the large towns of the kingdom sent up petitions. A few months of truce followed. It was the parliamentary vacation, the plans of the cabinet were still uncertain, and the petitioners hoped that they had succeeded in alarming the government. It was, however, plain by the winter that the policy of dear bread had won a decided victory in the cabinet, and the Corn Bill was introduced. The agitation was renewed immediately. On February 7, 1815, 42 petitions were presented to Parliament. On March 4 a mass meeting was held in London, at which city men of every shade of political opinion were represented. On this occasion 40,571 signatures were collected within 10 hours. The petition from Manchester bore 52,000 names, these made by these demonstrations the cabinet and its majority in Parliament persisted in their intentions. The protectionist Corn Bill was passed and the meetings degenerated into riots. But in spite of its ultimate failure, the monster agitation had made a deep impression. It is the first time, remarked the Morning Chronicle, when a majority of the adult male population of England has petitioned the two Houses of Parliament on any subject. X. The right of meeting and the right of petition merely enabled the governed to exert a somewhat spasmodic pressure on the government at exceptionally critical periods. But the British public at this period did not lack a means of exercising a permanent control over the policy of Parliament. On the contrary, for a century past, and especially during the last 50 years, there had been in existence a powerful instrument of public control, an instrument which came to be regarded as part of the unwritten constitution of the realm, namely, the political press. The English maintained that in their country the press was free. By this they did not mean that no expression of opinion was criminal, or that a journalist could without fear of prosecution hold up to hatred or contempt either the Constitution or an individual statesman, but that since the closing years of the 17th century the government had lost the right of preliminary censorship over printed matter. England was the sole country in Europe where liberty of the press in this sense existed. All political parties willingly or unwillingly agreed to declare this liberty inviolable. The opponents of the court party saw in it their surest guarantee against a despotic reaction. "Give me," exclaimed Sheridan in 1810, "but the liberty of the press, and I will give to the minister a venal House of Peers, I will give him a corrupt and servile House of Commons, I will give him the full swing of the patronage of office. Armed with the liberty of the press I will go forth to meet him undismayed." Indeed, the classic toast at Whig banquets was "The liberty of the press 'tis like the air we breathe, while we have it we cannot die." 8. The liberty of the press, however, had not been immune from attack. In the circumstances, it was hardly to be expected during the last half-century. During the first half of the reign, before the war with France, it had gained more ground than it lost. It was in vain that Parliament had attempted by means of antiquated legal decisions, originally intended to protect the House of Commons against the abuse of the royal prerogative, to prevent the newspapers publishing its debates. A protracted and stormy conflict had ended in the capitulation of the Tories. The extension in 1792 of the powers of the jury in libel cases furnished yet another guarantee for the liberty of journalists. With the anti-Jacobin scare, however, a new epoch opened, and the party of reaction attempted to take its revenge. A royal proclamation of May 21, 1792, against criminal and seditious writings was the government's declaration of war upon the journalists. Legislation of a novel kind followed. An Act of 1795 punished persons found guilty of having incited by speech or writing to hatred or contempt of the king or the government, with penalties amounting to 7 years' transportation for a second offence. An Act of 1798 prohibited the anonymous publication of newspapers. 6 clauses of the Act of 1799 against seditious societies imposed a system of registration upon the printers of books and newspapers, also upon the owners and even the makers of presses and type. Moreover, even apart from special legislation, the government possessed a number of indirect means to fetter the freedom of the press. The custom was established with ever-increasing stringency that those prosecuted by the government for libel might not prove the facts alleged. The procedure by ex officio informations enabled the Attorney General to dispense in the prosecution of journalists with the complicated formalities of a presentation by the grand jury. He could, moreover, bring journalists before a court where the judge was assisted not by the common jury, the assize jury, but by a special jury, which was selected according to different principles, and could be summoned whenever the government pleased. Journalists and their counsel complained, with or without justification, that a special jury was too often biased in favor of the prosecution. The Attorney General could also protract at pleasure the interval between the information and the trial. During that time he could reverse his original decision and abandon the prosecution. Even so, the journalist had been submitted to the threat of a prosecution, and this intimidation necessarily diminished his freedom. And in any case, even if the verdict were one of acquittal or if the trial were abandoned, the accused had to pay the costs. The government also took advantage of the financial difficulties with which it was confronted to raise the stamp duty from time to time. The existence of the newspapers was thus made increasingly difficult. The zeal displayed by the government in the repression of excesses on the part of the press was very considerable till the Peace of Amiens*, but was undoubtedly relaxed during the years immediately following. Between 1801 and 1807 the average yearly number of prosecutions did not exceed 2, only one such trial took place during the ministry of Fox and Lord Grenville. Then the prosecutions were renewed. In 1808 the adoption of new regulations hostile to the freedom of the press tightened up the existing legislation. The distinction was abolished between the procedure of ex officio informations and that of ordinary prosecutions registered. The number of prosecutions increased. Between 1808 and 1810 there were 42 ex officio informations, and 18 trials of journalists. An attack was made on important journalists such as Cobbett, whose political register was notorious for its attacks upon leading politicians, and Perry, the universally respected proprietor of the Morning Chronicle. And this period also witnessed a final attempt to restrict the right claimed by the press to report parliamentary debates. It was not legally recognized. A standing order forbade the publication of debates. Since it prevented any official account of the sessions, debaters in both houses were obliged to endure the publication of their speeches in an imperfect and often deliberately garbled report. This led to frequent complaints and the prosecution of journalists. It was only by favor of the House that the public was permitted to be present at the sessions of Parliament. Any member had the power to call attention at will to the illegal presence of strangers, and the gallery must then be cleared immediately. This actually happened in 18R0. When the House of Commons began the discussion of a disastrous military expedition, a member successfully called upon the House to expel the public and constitute itself a secret committee. Windham, who had made himself famous in Parliament for his unwearied protests against the impudence of the press, seized the opportunity to utter once more his hatred of the reporters who listened to his speech and took it down: a vile set, bankrupts, lottery office keepers, footmen, and decayed tradesmen. An obscure city politician, an old Jacobin of 1792 named John Gale Jones, procured the adoption by a small democratic club of an order of the day protesting against this exclusion of the public. He was arrested without any legal formality by order of the Commons for breach of privilege and brought before the bar of the House. Sir Francis Burdett, the representative of democracy in Parliament, published in Cobbett's Political Register a lengthy address to his constituents, in which he protested against this procedure. Thereupon he was himself imprisoned. It was an unskillful and useless attempt at reaction. For it was not an energetic attack on the press by the government, but a desperate effort of self-defense against journalists, whose independence and audacity were constantly increasing. The scandal concerning the Duke of York implicated the War Office and affected the honor of the royal family. The newspapers loudly voiced the popular indignation. Burdett had been in prison 7 weeks when on May 3, 1810, the Duke of Cumberland's scandal occurred. The ministers confronted with events so disastrous to the prestige of the government were men of mean abilities and personally unpopular. It availed them little to multiply prosecutions. Every case must go before a jury, and the government had therefore to consider, before undertaking a prosecution, whether or no it could count on the desired condemnation. The indefinite postponement of so many trials was not perhaps due to a Machiavellian scheme, as the opposition journalists would have us believe. The Attorney General hesitated and temporized because he dared not face a jury. Though Cobbett had been found guilty, Perry had been acquitted. Not only did a jury often acquit those whom the government required it to condemn. The foes of the government, when libeled by the official press, could appeal to the courts in their turn and obtain damages. This course was adopted, for instance, in 1810 by Roger O'Connor, a friend of Sir Francis Burdett. Even if the condemnation of the journalist were secured, the government had gained little by the trial. The publicity of the article incriminated was increased tenfold. The Attorney General was obliged to reproduce its text in his pleading, and on the following day the entire press could publish with impunity, as part of the Attorney General's accusation, a writing judged by the government libelous or seditious. In 1809 an article by Cobbett on the question of corporal punishment in the army had been held to compromise military discipline and the safety of the realm. But as a result of the prosecution, the question of flogging in the army was discussed in every newspaper. Fresh trials were commenced, which of course served only to bring the matter before an even wider public. In 1811 the government promised reforms. A condemned journalist was not subject in prison to the treatment of criminals and ordinary offenders. When Cobbett was imprisoned in Newgate, he spent his mornings editing his paper, his afternoons receiving his political friends. He employed his 2 years' imprisonment in conducting a campaign on behalf of the freedom of the press. The contest between the House of Commons and Sir Francis Burdett provoked a riot in the London streets. but Sir Francis, avoiding the manifestations prepared in his honor, deprived the popular triumph of its final crown. And even so the government was obliged to yield. Already in 1809 journalists had secured certain reductions in the stamp duty. The Act of 1808, empowering the Attorney General to imprison accused journalists as a precautionary measure, was applied on one single occasion, and fell thenceforward into disuse. In 1811 the government relaxed the provisions of the penal statutes of 1798 and 1799,3 and during the 4 years following the number of trials for expressions of opinion once more became insignificant. 11. The empire of the press was in process of foundation. To be sure, a large and important press was already in existence at the close of the 18th century, and the number of newspapers had scarcely increased since that date. The progressive increase of the stamp duty, the enhanced cost of paper, the rise of salaries, had compelled an increase in the price of newspapers. In 1815 a big daily paper cost 7d.5, but 25 years of dramatic events, of revolutions, of battles had aroused in the public both of London and the provinces an insatiable appetite for news, which had enabled journalism to develop in the face of all obstacles and increase the circulation of the papers already in existence. In London there were daily papers, both morning and evening, of which several editions appeared on days when any event of importance occurred. 1 There were papers appearing thrice weekly, and weekly papers which summed up every Sunday the events of the week, and flourished in spite of all the efforts made by the Sabbatarians to prevent this violation of the Lord's Day. Many of these papers, edited by adventurers and banned by the police, led a highly precarious existence, always on the lookout for a scandal which would enable them to enjoy a few weeks of ephemeral popularity. Far above such miserable rags 5 or 6 leading newspapers stood out: the Times, the Morning Chronicle, the Morning Post, the Courier, and the Morning Herald. They consisted of 4 pages of small print. The first and fourth of these were devoted to advertisements. On the second were 2 columns of extracts from the Parisian newspapers. Then followed advertisements of theatres and the news of the day, chiefly concerning domestic politics. Sometimes, though by no means every day, one of the items of news was accompanied by a lengthy comment which already constituted a leading article. The third page contained foreign news, sporting and society news, law reports, and an occasional article of dramatic criticism. When Parliament was sitting, the whole of the second page was occupied by a report of the proceedings in the House, a report which would often take up, in addition, a part of the third and might even, if a matter of great importance were being debated, fill almost the entire paper. This arrangement is, though on a smaller scale, that of a leading English newspaper today. The Times, which had been printed for a year past by steam, had a daily circulation of 5,000, the Courier sometimes reached a circulation of 10,000. The proprietors of leading newspapers, such as John Walter of the Times, Daniel Stewart of the Morning Post, Perry of the Morning Chronicle, were persons of no slight importance, and the magnificent appointments of their offices, their rosewood tables and silver inkstands, awed and dazzled poor editors. 1 Among the weeklies, Cobbett's Political Register was undeniably in the front rank, a paper always violent, often scurrilous in its attacks not only upon the party in office but also upon the moderate opposition, but excellently informed all the same. An equally high position was held by Leigh Hunt's Examiner, a paper as radical in its political complexion as the Register, but first of the London journals for literary merit. In the provinces each county town possessed its weekly paper, often 2 papers, one supporting the government, the other the opposition. They were modelled on the London papers. But the news from the continent was not so recent, and the local news more detailed. An excellent system of distribution enabled the proprietors to sell their paper the moment almost it was printed, in all the market towns of the district, sometimes even to dispatch copies to other country towns, there to compete with the local press. These proprietors prided themselves on an unimpeachable respectability, and their papers were serious in tone, independent, and well furnished with news. Their readers were the local gentry, shopkeepers, and farmers, a fairly extensive and extremely constant and reliable public. The total number of newspapers published in London and in the provinces was about 250. In 1753 the stamp duty was paid on 7,411,757 copies, in 1792 on 15,005,760, that is on more than double. In 1801 it was paid on 16 million, the number had hardly increased by a million during the previous decade. Then progress began afresh. In 1821 duty would be paid on 25 million copies. The commercial invention on which modern English journalism was based was the combination of the newspaper with the advertiser. This combination dated from the decade between 1770 and 1780, when George III was engaged in a stubborn contest with the London press. The press, though formidable through the savagery of its attacks, had nevertheless fallen very low in public opinion. It was no longer conducted, as during the earlier half of the century, by eminent men of letters, by men of high birth, by statesmen, men such as Steele and Addison, Bolingbroke and Pulteney. It had fallen into the hands of literary adventurers, of sharpers, of rogues of every description. Little by little it was to raise its head once more by adapting itself to the new needs of the period and becoming an industry. No longer, as of old, was it to be literary and witty. In future it would be serious, commercial, practical. It is true that the profession of a journalist was still regarded as barely respectable, but a few years had passed since the attempt of the bar to prevent barristers from engaging in journalism. In 1825 Walter Scott was to refuse for his son-in-law the post of editor of a leading London paper, as in his opinion unworthy of his social position. Nevertheless, the proprietor of a newspaper was climbing the social ladder and conquering by degrees the position naturally taken in a mercantile society by men of commerce and business men of all kinds. Usually a group representative of a particular interest, for example, a syndicate of coach builders, auctioneers, booksellers, or brewers, advanced the necessary capital for the foundation of a new paper to obtain in this way the free use of the advertisement columns. Once the paper had achieved success, the editor would often find the control of the syndicate burdensome and attempt to shake it off. The syndicate would avenge itself by founding a rival paper. It was in these circumstances that a syndicate of booksellers founded the British Press, a morning paper, in opposition to the Morning Post, and the Globe, an evening paper, in opposition to the Courier. But even when the syndicate maintained its control over the editor, his dependence upon it emancipated him from the control which political groups, the court, the party organizations sought to exercise over him in other directions. Regarded from this point of view, the growing independence of the press was another form of the plutocracy which marks the 19th century. The government, feeling itself powerless to destroy the freedom of the press, sought to use the newspapers to support its policy. What, however, could it offer the proprietor as the price of his services? A pecuniary bribe was out of the question. The advertisements brought far more than the government could offer and were paying better every day. Moreover, the wider the circulation of the paper, the more profitable the advertisements were, and to attract the public the paper must bow not to the orders of the cabinet, but to the popular taste. In 1815 the proprietor of the Times would not have agreed, as his father had agreed 20 years earlier, to support the policy of the government in return for a pension of £600. Nor was it of any use for the government to offer official announcements. On the contrary, it had more need of the papers to publish its announcements than they of the government. Nor had it news to offer. The time was gone by when the government was better informed of passing events than the press. Although the proprietors of the London papers did not as yet employ regular correspondents stationed permanently in the great capitals of the world, or attached, almost officially, to the staff of warring armies, it was nevertheless common knowledge that they were prepared to pay handsomely for news brought secretly from continental ports. They made a skillful use of private correspondence. They had devised a host of methods by which the British press had become a clearing house for the rumors of Europe. The government had indeed attempted, as a last resource, to intercept the couriers employed by the newspapers, and oblige the press to purchase as a favor the services of the official post. But these attempts had failed. 5 years of conflict had resulted in the victory of the Times, which had foiled the government's tricks. 1 We must therefore conclude that the accusations of servility and venality brought by the opposition organs against the papers supporting the government credited the latter with much more influence than in fact it possessed. Even the ministerial organs depended rather on the public than on the cabinet. In 1809 the Courier had turned against the government in the matter of the Duke of York. In 1814 and 1815 all the government papers deserted the ministry on the questions of the property tax and the Corn Bill. No paper that has any character, Lord Liverpool wrote to Lord Castlereagh, and consequently an established sale, will accept money from the government, and indeed their profits are so enormous in all critical times, when their support is the snost necessary, that no pecuniary assistance that the government could offer would really be worth their acceptance. The truth is, they look only to their sale. They make their way like sycophants with the public, by finding out the prejudices and prepossessions of the moment, and then flattering them, and the number of soi-disant government or opposition papers abound just as the government is generally popular or unpopular. In the House of Commons Windham was wont to defend the thesis that the British Constitution would be altered and England become a democracy if the newspapers were permitted to report parliamentary debates and criticise them freely. His contention was not wholly unfounded. In the 18th century writers on constitutional law had been accustomed to discuss the problem whether or no democracy were practicable in a large state, and whether it was possible to conceive of democracies of a different type from those which had obtained in the city-states of the ancient world, and were being held up by Rousseau as a model for modern imitation. When the United States of America had been founded, it was thought that the solution of the problem had been furnished by federalism, and that a large democratic state could be constructed by federating a number of small republics, but the new development taken by the political press had rendered federalism unnecessary. Thanks to the progress of printing, and the improvement of the means of transport, it had become possible for the parliamentary orator, for the editor of a leading newspaper, daily to lay his view of the political events of the day before every citizen of a great nation. And in this way the newspaper editors performed the part played by the demagogue in the petty republics of antiquity. Obviously the effect produced by the newspaper politician was less immediate and did not provoke so violent a response as a demagogue's speech. The scattered readers of a newspaper were a public, not a mob. There was, however, exactly the same sensationalism, the same appeal to the emotions of the multitude. In this way the modern newspaper has reduced the dimensions of an entire country to those of an ancient agora or forum. We have seen that rebellion, or the menace of rebellion, or milder forms of rebellion, popular demonstrations, public meetings, general petitions, political associations, newspapers, were weapons employed by the Englishman as his traditional right for the defense of his liberty. But the very need to employ them proves that the Constitution, understood in the strict sense of the term, was an insufficient safeguard. According to the theory of the Constitution, which regarded it as a mixture in 3 equal parts of 3 distinct principles of government, the House of Commons, as opposed to the Crown and the Upper House, represented the democratic principle but the guarantees of their liberty and interests which the people should have found in the House of Commons, they were, in fact, obliged to seek elsewhere against the House of Commons itself. That is to say, the interests of the Crown and those of both Houses of Parliament had now become identical. No longer did a conflict of interests render each a check upon the 2 others, securing thus a balance of political forces. The Constitution had been stultified. This was the belief of all who demanded a reform of Parliament, and of those especially who wished this reform to be radical, and who were therefore shortly to receive the nickname of radicals. In their opinion, the House of Commons could never represent the will of the people, could never perform the function assigned to it by the Constitution, until it was elected by all the taxpayers or even by all adult males without exception. William Cobbett, a former anti-Jacobin writer who had broken with the Tories, was the journalistic mouthpiece of this new group. Sunday by Sunday, In his political register, he fulminated wholesale denunciations of the self-seeking and absence of political conscience displayed equally by both the great parliamentary parties. Henry Hunt, the man with the white hat, a violent demagogue, Major Cartwright, an old dotard termed in mockery the mother of parliamentary reform, founded societies to carry on the propaganda and addressed public meetings. The group began to display its activity during the general elections of 1806 and 1807. In 1809 Sir Francis Burdett, member for Westminster, brought forward a motion in favour of the extension of the franchise to all taxpayers. The same year the party gained a more important adherent in the person of Bentham. He had been known previously in England as a prison reformer, on the continent as a penologist. His political opinions had been conservative and sceptical. His Catechism of Parliamentary Reform, which appeared in 1810, announced his conversion to the cause of radical reform. He became the philosopher of the party. Near him at Westminster lived his secretary, James Mill, who recruited for him the intellectual youth of the nation. Francis Place meanwhile was organizing the electors. It was in truth a motley group, and had few adherents. Its prestige was due to the fact that it brought forward with untiring zeal arguments to justify the growing feckling of dissatisfaction with the parliamentary machine which had been felt for some years past by the British public. Pitt and Fox were in their graves, and no statesman of the first rank was left in Parliament. The English, not merely those who were eager for reform and took a keen interest in politics, but the indifferent and fickle masses were disgusted by the mediocrity of the politicians. Democratic orators and publicists but voiced their own unuttered suspicions, when they called the leaders of both parties to account for the courtesy and consideration with which they treated their opponents. What, they asked, could this courtesy and consideration mean if the two parties stood for ideas, were radically divided from each other by a difference of principle? But in reality the two parties did not represent ideas. They were merely two rival factions disputing the possession of power, the ins and the outs, and since the outs knew that some day or other the turn of the political wheel would put them into office, they were very guarded in their attacks on abuses by which sooner or later they would themselves profit. And, again, why did every member of Parliament defend so obstinately the antiquated constitutional dogma which taught that immediately on his election he became independent of his constituents, and that the House of Commons would be no longer a free and deliberative assembly, if the members took orders from those who had sent them to Parliament? Nor was this thesis maintained only by the Tories. Romilly, the typical Whig theorist, and an advocate of administrative and parliamentary reform, had made it a point of honor for the past 3 years not to enter into any engagement with the Bristol electorate to support these reforms. It is not surprising that the electors would have none of him, and the Democrats were committed to an implacable feud with this liberal pedant. More recently, in the course of the debates on the Corn Bill, Western had actually boasted of his indifference to his constituents' opinion, and William Smith even thought it necessary to apologize for deferring to it. Nevertheless, the radical reformers were not justified in ascribing this divorce between Parliament and public opinion wholly to the defective franchise. We grossly overvalue democratic institutions did we believe that the adoption of manhood suffrage or of any other very broad franchise can of itself secure immediately an absolute identity of interest and a complete harmony of sentiment between the electorate and their representatives. Moreover, the unpopularity of the Commons, of the parties who composed it and the statesmen who led it, was but recent and passing. The days of Pitt were not long past, the days of Canning were in the near future. We must take a sufficiently long period into consideration if we would form a just estimate of the working of the British Parliament during the latter half of the reign of George III, an estimate which will, indeed, account for the temporary discredit into which both parties had fallen, but will recognize that all the while both parties had been laying insensibly the foundations of the future democracy. 11. We will study first the Whig opposition, now become so weak and so unpopular. How shall we account for the profound discredit into which had fallen a party once the incarnation of England's soul? The Whigs had not really been vanquished, as they alleged, by the gold of King George and his friends. The true cause of their defeat was that public opinion had repudiated a policy too obviously oligarchic. Their downfall dated from the year 1784, the year which had witnessed a reconciliation between Fox, the bitter opponent of the American War, and Lord North, who as Prime Minister had been responsible for it. The two statesmen, as the result of a joint intrigue, had formed a coalition cabinet and secured a chance majority in Parliament. They fell together when they attempted by their East India Bill to subject the entire Indian Empire to the control of a committee sitting in London, whose 9 original members were to be the nominees of Parliament. This meant the open and direct annexation of the colonial government by the great parliamentary families. George III rebelled against the scheme, secured the rejection of the East India Bill by a small majority of the House of Lords, dismissed Fox and Lord North, and appointed as Prime Minister the youthful William Pitt, a son of Lord Chatham, who had resisted pressing solicitations to enter the coalition cabinet, and had constituted himself the advocate in Parliament of an extensive reform of the franchise. The country declared in favour of Pitt against Fox and Lord North. In other words, the nation repudiated the Whigs the moment they ceased to represent a principle, the defence of the liberties of the people, and degenerated into a mere coalition of selfish factions. Within a few months they had lost the fruits of a century of prestige and power. This had overthrown the Whigs in 1784, and still in 1815 it remained one of the causes of their weakness. For the last 15 years, the Tory party had been tending to split, and the Whigs had attempted to make use of the division to rally to their standard the greatest possible number of deserters and attempt once more that policy of coalition which in 1784 had served them so ill. Even the old epithets of Whig and Tory, hallowed by tradition and implying a policy of definite principles, had fallen into disuse. Men now spoke only of the opposition and the party in office. The effect of these intrigues upon the country at large we know already. Popular opinion regarded with the same indifference and contempt all the groups which disputed in Parliament the possession of power. Nor had the Whigs' new tactics met with better success in the House of Commons itself. By their policy of compromise they had not captured a sufficient number of votes to compensate for their loss of popularity. On this point, at least, there was no divergence between the Commons and the nation. The days of political oligarchy were past. During the first 15 years of the new century the characteristic feature of English parliamentary life had been the decline of the system of aristocratic groups and the speedy disintegration of any such group that showed signs of formation. Of these groups Addington's had been the earliest. It is remarkable that the leader of this new clique did not belong to a noble family of established political importance, nor even to an old county family. He was merely the son of an eminent physician who had had the good fortune to number Lord Chatham among his patients. His sisters had made good matches, and he owed his entry into Parliament to the patronage of his brother-in-law, James Sutton. Pitt had taken him up, made him Speaker of the Commons, and designated him his successor if ever circumstances should compel his resignation. He found himself Prime Minister. Pitt was willing to be his friend so long as he was content to remain the obedient agent of his policy, ready to re-enter the ranks should his patron ever decide to return to office. Addington, however, had come to believe in his own greatness, and since the conclusion of the Treaty of Amiens the Foxites had flattered his vanity by praising his policy of peace. When hostilities broke out afresh, Pitt tried in vain to resume the direction of affairs. He failed to win Addington's consent by the offer of an important post in his ministry. Whereupon, yielding to the solicitations of his friends, he led a direct attack upon the cabinet and rendered its existence so precarious that Addington was compelled to resign. Nevertheless, Pitt's former lieutenant was now in command of an independent group. He was followed by a small company, numbering in all some 40 or 60 members of the House of Commons, and including his brother John Hilly Addington, his brother-in-law James Adams, Lord Hobart, Bond, Bathurst, Vansittart, and Lord Powys. It was in vain that Pitt effected a reconciliation with Addington and gave him a seat in his cabinet with the title of Lord Sidmouth. He knew perfectly well that his credit with the king stood as high as the Prime Minister's. and his unbending Toryism had made him popular with the country gentlemen. He acted, therefore, just as he pleased, voted at times against Pitt, and even when a member of the cabinet continued to behave as the leader of an independent faction. His position in Parliament was further strengthened, and Pitt's party rendered even weaker, by the secession of another group. Lord Grenville, who for many years had been Pitt's faithful subordinate, now came forward to advocate a junction of all the parties, or as it was termed, of all the talents, and the admission of Fox into the cabinet. King George, however, rejected the proposed coalition and Grenville was compelled to retire. Henceforward the opposition possessed two heads: Fox, representing the old, and Lord Grenville, representing the new, opposition. This cooperation, to use the expression which the Allied groups loved to employ, to avoid the discredited term coalition, strengthened the opposition in the Commons by some 30 votes. Lord Grenville, Lord Temple, Lord Nugent, and Admiral Fremantle led this new group of aristocrats. After Pitt's death in the early days of 1806, the king resigned himself to accept a cabinet formed by the alliance of the groups led respectively by Fox, Lord Grenville, and Lord Sidmouth. The new ministry failed, however, to gain the confidence of the country. Fox died in September, and the men of the old opposition, now led by Grey, lost their influence in the cabinet. The Grenville faction received an accession of strength, and Lord Sidmouth's party was also strengthened. From these groups the nation could scarcely expect a war against aristocratic privilege and administrative abuses. Moreover, in the February of 1807 the king quarrelled with his ministers on the question of Catholic emancipation. The cabinet resigned, and Pitt's orthodox disciples returned to power. Once more the policy of coalition had brought disaster upon the Whigs. Nevertheless, the disintegration of the party in office continued. In 1809 Canning, Foreign Secretary in the Duke of Portland's cabinet, provoked a cabinet crisis by his intemperate ambition. Although the son of an actress, a political pamphleteer of no particular standing, and without noble connections of any kind, he had entertained since Pitt's death the dream of taking his place as the great national statesman. In his impatience to attain the first rank he engineered an intrigue against his colleague, Lord Castlereagh, the Secretary for War. Castlereagh, who, like Canning, was faithful to the policy of Pitt, had planned a disembarkation of English troops on the island of Walcheren. Canning immediately opposed the expedition in principle and its fact plan. He told the Duke of Portland that he did not wish to form part of a cabinet containing the organizer of this disastrous campaign, and he obtained from the weakness of his chief a secret promise to compel Lord Castlereagh to resign as soon as the expedition had been concluded and its folly proved. The plot might have succeeded if Lord Castlereagh had not discovered it. Then England presented to the astonished gaze of Europe the spectacle of a duel between the Foreign Secretary and the Secretary for War. The cabinet could not survive so grave a scandal, and resigned as a body. Perceval then reconstructed a Tory cabinet in which neither Canning nor Lord Castlereagh found a place. Canning, at once the most ambitious and the most eloquent of the members of the lower house, was henceforward the leader of a new group, united not by the influence of a noble family, but by the personal genius of its leader. It comprised some 15 members of the House of Commons. Among them were Sturgeborn, Robert Smith, James William Ward, and, most important of all, Huskisson, a man, to be sure, of obscure origin, a retired banker according to some, a retired chemist. According to others but a great financier whose merit had already won the recognition of Pitt. In 1812 a further secession occurred, the effect of which was to strengthen the Canning group. The Marquis of Wellesley, Canning's successor at the Foreign Office, resigned on the ground that he had not the weight in the government which he expected when he accepted office, inspired by the memory of his viceroyalty of India, and the victories now being won in Spain and Portugal by his brother Wellington. His ambition knew no bounds. His connection, an aristocratic connection of the old style, entered into close relations with the group led by Canning. What was there to prevent the two statesmen from undertaking the leadership of a new administration, the former in the Lords, the latter in the Commons? It must surely enjoy a prestige to which Perceval's Ministry of Dullards could never aspire. The proposed cabinet was, if possible, to consist only of Tories. If necessary, however, the co-operation of the Whigs was to be invited, for the latter possessed no candidate whom they could seriously put forward in opposition to Canning to represent the government in the House of Commons. Wellesley and Canning also counted on the support of the Prince Regent, for the Marquis was his intimate friend. Moreover, the Regent possessed devoted servants among the Whigs, Lord Moira in the Lords, Sheridan in the Commons. Never had the coalition of groups which constituted the opposition been stronger than in these opening months of 1812. When Perceval was assassinated in May, the House demanded by a majority of 4 a radical alteration of the government's policy. But although everything appeared to conspire to the triumph of the opposition, it continued to suffer from the same defect of internal organization. When all was said, it was only a coalition of groups and the day of groups was over. The Prince Regent proved false. He took advantage of the differences of opinion which showed themselves between the leaders of the coalition to bring about the failure of the negotiations. Lord Grey and Lord Grenville were in favour of a policy as 177. Pacific as circumstances would permit. Wellesley and Canning, on the other hand, were denouncing the slackness with which the Tories were carrying on the war. The two groups were unable to agree upon a common Tory policy, and the Regent formed a strictly Tory cabinet. Lord Liverpool was Prime Minister, Lord Castlereagh Foreign Secretary. Lord Sidmouth's group was bought with the most important posts in the government, and was henceforth merged in the main body of orthodox Toryism. T. Wellington meanwhile entered Madrid, and Napoleon retreated from Moscow. The despairing forecasts of Grey and Grenville, for whom victory over Napoleon was an absolute impossibility, were thus refuted, as was also the contention of Wellesley and Canning that victory could never be obtained until they were permitted to infuse fresh vigour into the prosecution of the war. Lord Liverpool seized his opportunity, dissolved Parliament in September and strengthened his majority. The disintegration of the Tories was suddenly arrested, and it was now the opposition that fell to pieces. Canning realized his impotence. The great families which composed the Whig aristocracy had always regarded him as a dangerous upstart. Pitt's orthodox disciples were irretrievably committed against him. Even before the election of 1812, Wellesley and Canning had entered into negotiations with the cabinet. After the election their position was worse than before. Disavowed by Wellington, Wellesley abandoned the ambitions of the past 2 years. Never might he hope to be Prime Minister. Indeed, he no longer possessed even a following in Parliament. In 1813 Canning flatly refused an offer to become the recognised leader of the opposition in the House of Commons. The following year he solemnly discharged his group of supporters, and declared his followers free to act and vote according to their individual judgment. His brother, Stratford Canning, accepted from the government a special diplomatic mission to the Swiss cantons. Thomas Sydenham, a former member of Wellesley's group, a similar mission to the court of Lisbon. Wellesley Pole became Master of the Mint. To furnish Huskisson with a place in the cabinet, the new post of Chief Commissioner of Woods and Forests and Land Revenues was created expressly for him. Canning himself accepted from Lord Castlereagh a splendid and purposeless mission to the court of Portugal. "It was like the last lottery," exclaimed Tierney, "where there were no blanks, but all prizes." But in reality Canning, like Wellesley, had failed. Had he but served his party faithfully, his superior personal endowments would have given him in due time the uncontested leadership. And if his ambition had not led him into intrigues which strengthened the position of their intended victim, Castlereagh, instead of being the arbiter of European politics, might have buried his political reputation in Walch Erin. Thus of all the groups which had successively seceded from the Tory ranks since the beginning of the century, one alone, Lord Grenville's, still remained faithful to the opposition, but its self-seeking and greed made it wholly unreliable. In 1813 the Grenvilles had already begun to detach themselves from active politics, leaving their clients, Fremantle, Wynne, Horner, and Plunkett, the Irishmen, to uphold their standard in the field of debate. And they would shortly betray their followers. After their departure, what elements, or rather what remnants, were left to compose the opposition in Parliament? A few Whig families, Mackintosh told Thomas More in 1819, are our only security for the Constitution. In the soremost rank were the great families of the Revolution: the Percys, the Cavendishes, the Russells, the Howards. The Duke of Bedford, head of the Russell family and owner of immense estates in Bedfordshire, Devon, and the heart of London, was an influential politician. Samuel Whitbread, the Democrat, was his intimate friend. His eldest son, the Marquis of Tavistock, took an active part in the debates in the House of Commons. But of his three other sons, one, Lord George, was on active service, another, Lord William, was plunged so deeply in debt that he dared not show his face at Westminster, and the third, copyright Lord John, who was hereafter to confer such honour on the family, had scarcely attained his majority and entered Parliament. The glory of the family had been under eclipse since the death in 1802 of the 5th Duke of Bedford, a great agriculturalist, who had taken part in public life and been honoured by the invective of Burke and a funeral panegyric by Fox. Alone among the heads of noble families, Charles Howard, Duke of Norfolk, who died in 1815, had preserved throughout all the long years of the war the great political traditions of the old English aristocracy. His love of racing was so intense that he was commonly nicknamed the Jockey. Boon companion of the Prince of Wales, a hard drinker, a gambler, a byword for dirt and untidiness, but a man of culture and a brilliant conversationalist, he had been deprived by Pitt of his Lord Lieutenancy for having toasted at a public banquet our sovereign, the people. An ardent politician, around his Sussex castle at Arundel he had enlarged his electoral fief. At Hereford, Gloucester, and Carlisle he led the popular party. In Gloucestershire in 1811, alone of all the local aristocracy, he had supported, and supported successfully, an independent candidate. He gave Romilly a seat when he had failed to secure his election at Bristol. Among his clients was Creevey, the Democrat. He was indeed the typical Whig, an aristocratic Republican, who passed his entire life provoking by his insolence the pride of king and ministers. Other families grouped themselves round these great houses. George Ponsonby, chosen in 1808 as leader of the opposition in the Commons in preference to the irresolute Tierney and the violent Whitbread, represented one of the three great families who disputed the empire of rural Ireland. The Ponsonbys were allies of the Fitzwilliams, a powerful Yorkshire family, and Lord Fitzwilliam's son, Lord Milton, was in 1815 among the hopes of the Whig party. In the upper house the opposition was led by Lord Grey in conjunction with Lord Grenville. Lord Grosvenor and Lord Folkestone played a very active part in politics, the former in the Lords, the latter in the Commons. But there is no need to enumerate all the Whig families who together marshalled 100 or 130 members of the House of Commons. We need only mention two noble families whose intellectual and literary activities surpassed even their political, and who occupied a place apart in the ranks of the opposition. The prestige of Lansdowne House was due to Lord Shelburne, 1st Marquis of Lansdowne, the friend of Adam Smith, a patron of Bentham, a correspondent of the French encyclopedists. His second son, now heir to the title, had made a brilliant debut in the House of Commons. When he passed to the upper house he fell into the background of political life, but this rendered it all the easier for him to continue his father's traditions both in London and at Bowood. Mackintosh, Romilly, Dumont of Geneva, and Madame de Stael gathered under his roof. Nevertheless, Lansdowne House was in its decline. Holland House, on the contrary, was at the height of its fame. It was there that Fox had died in 1806 in the presence of his nephew and niece, Lord and Lady Holland. Lord Holland was an ardent Whig and an able politician. The goddess of the shrine, Lady Holland, though neither a beauty nor a woman of high intellectual gifts, was a born ruler. Owing to the irregular circumstances of her marriage with Lord Holland, she was not received at the strict court of George III. She took her revenge by establishing a court of her own, by opening a salon, where she received, commanded, and bullied every Englishman of eminence in the ranks of the opposition, men of letters, philosophers, and publicists. Lord Holland and his wife were too independent not to make many enemies. They were charged with affecting cosmopolitanism, and their zeal for the cause of Spanish independence offended the advocates of peace at any price. Both Lansdowne House and Holland House regarded the important Opposition Review, the Edinburgh Review, as their appanage. Thus the two houses kept the Whig aristocracy in touch with the thought of the day, and prevented the Whigs from degenerating into a group of great country families. This was no slight service. Lord Grenville, commenting in the July of 1813 on the dissolution of the Canning Group, expressed himself in the following terms: "What I most lament in it is the discredit which it throws on all party connection, the upholding which, on its true foundation of public principle, I take to be essential to the benefit of a parliamentary constitution. The mere fact of a party being thus dissolved shows abundantly it could exist to no good purpose." What, however, did Lord Grenville understand by this party system which he regarded as the essence of parliamentary government? Did he mean that in every free country parties would necessarily be formed divided from each other either by philosophic or religious tenets or by their members' economic interests? If so, he merely stated a truism, though, of course, the spirit of party may overpass the limits necessary to maintain national unity, and party strife degenerate into a civil war in which the combatants, though members of the same social organism, no longer recognize any common principles of political conduct. Perhaps, however, he meant to endorse Burke's doctrine that the contending parties, if they were not to become two hostile societies, two nations in one, must entrust the care of their interests, sentiments, and convictions to an oligarchy of noble families, who, because they belonged to the same class, could observe in their warfare a strict code of behavior and be loyal to common political principles. The outstanding work to be achieved by English politics in the 19th century would in fact be the perpetuation of parliamentary aristocracy. Such a feat, however, could be accomplished only by adapting this aristocratic polity persistently and skillfully to the changing needs of a society which was becoming industrial and democratic. During the first years of the 19th century, however, the mass of the population found this process of adaptation too slow. The nation regarded the intrigue of Lord Wellesley and Canning as a survival of the system of oligarchic groups. Nor was Burke's interpretation of the system accepted by public opinion. For the past 30 years the parties had been regarded not as patriarchal groups, fixed immovably in their ancestral principles, but as shifting cliques, the offspring of intrigue, and formed to exploit the emoluments of office. The memory of the coalition of 1784 hung heavily, as was indeed simple justice, over the repeated attempts of the opposition to get together a majority in Parliament hostile to the Tories. The party in office was a homogeneous whole, the opposition a federation of independent groups. When it is regarded from this standpoint, it is clear that the victory of the Tories, supported as it was by public opinion, tended to raise the standard of political morality. 14. Nevertheless, extenuating circumstances may be pleaded in favor of the opposition. Never during the past half-century of adverse fortune had the party, as its accusers alleged, wholly betrayed the cause of reform. Even the partial betrayal of which it was in fact guilty was only too often due to the knowledge that it lacked the support of the country. During the opening years of the reign prior to the disastrous coalition of 1784, the Whigs had relied on the people to support their resistance to King George. The legislation of the period witnesses to the energy with which, when in office, they had effected reforms, and when in opposition had compelled their opponents to yield to their demands for reform. We have already seen how the government undertook the reform of the administration, and regulated the exercise of the royal prerogative of pensions, reducing thus the means of parliamentary corruption at the disposal of the Crown. At the same time a beginning was made with the reform of the franchise. The Grenville Act of 17,701 limited the right claimed by the majority of the House of Commons to decide contested returns at their arbitrary pleasure. The new act referred the hearing of election petitions to a select committee chosen by lot. Another act, passed in 1782, forbade government contractors to sit in the House, especially contractors to the War Office and the Admiralty. And simultaneously the composition of the electorate was modified. Statutes were passed restricting the franchise, which would reduce the influence of the Crown and the nouveau riches. An Act of 1782 deprived tax collectors and customs officers of the vote. An Act of 1763 provided that honorary freemen might not exercise the borough franchise unless they had received the freedom at least 12 months before the election. An Act of 1786 exacted from Scot and lot electors a residence of at least 6 months to qualify for a vote. An Act of 1788 provided that the county electors must have been on the register at least a month before they were entitled to vote. Other measures, on the contrary, enlarged the franchise to punish the electors of certain small boroughs who had too openly put up their votes to auction. This fate befell New Shoreham in 1771, Cricklade in 1782. Finally, in 1788, Parliament repealed a statute of 1729 which had stereotyped the franchise in each constituency, as it had been fixed by the last decision of the House of Commons registered. The right to revise its former decisions was thus restored to Parliament registered. The House of Commons had now at its disposal an instrument by which the entire franchise might be reformed piecemeal, constituency by constituency. Great reforms are, however, but rarely effected by a series of petty changes. Public opinion towards the close of the 18th century became too strongly democratic to be content with so slow and so complicated a procedure. Democratic republics were founded in America and in France. The doctrines now professed in Paris, such as the theories of the social contract, the rights of man, and the sovereignty of the people, were old ideas in England. Fox, the leader of the opposition, recognized in the principles of 1789 the Whig principles of 1688, and advocated peace with democratic France. Among his supporters Lord Grey was devoting himself to the cause of parliamentary reform. A small number of great families, with whom rebellion was a tradition and who were ready to go to any lengths rather than yield to the court, adopted the same line of policy. Nevertheless, these new Whigs, Jacobins as they were termed, were but a handful. Clergy, gentry, financiers, merchants, manufacturers, even the proletariat, in short, all classes of society united to oppose them. The indignation excited by the savage excesses of the French Terror produced in England by reaction an anti-Jacobin terror. Fear of a French invasion enlisted on behalf of the Tories the warlike and patriotic sentiments formerly exploited by the Whigs in the days of Louis XIV and Louis XV. The vast majority of the Whigs deserted the opposition and entered the Tory ranks. In the person of Burke, a Whig became the philosopher of the counter-revolution in Europe. Evidently misfortune dogged the steps of Fox and his friends. In 1784 public opinion had repudiated them because their policy was too oligarchic. In 1792 it repudiated them because their policy was too democratic. Finally, in 1797, weary of protests which fell on deaf ears, Fox and his followers ceased even to attend the sessions of Parliament. The years pass, we approach 1815, we witness a return on the part of the Whigs to the policy of coalition. But the great opposition families never abandoned entirely the cause of reform. In 1808 Whitbread, indignant that he had been given no place 2 years earlier in the Fox-Grenville cabinet, and still more indignant that after the fall of the ministry he had not been designated leader of the opposition in the Commons, marshalled under his banner some 50 members, who, regardless of the political strategy adopted by their party, called loudly for peace at any price and the suppression of abuses. But the members of this group, termed sometimes the mountain men such as Lord Cochrane, Lord Folkestone, Creevey, and Peter Moore were attached to the great aristocratic connections. 1 Whitbread himself was a wealthy brewer and Grey's brother-in-law. At Bedford, which he represented, he was in alliance with the Russells and their clients. So little did the violence of his policy involve him in strife with the other opposition groups that in 1812, when the defeat of the Tory government was expected, he was promised the Home Office in the new cabinet. We have already had occasion to notice the progress of administrative reform during this period, and sinecures and offices in reversion were on the eve of abolition. Even as regards the reform of the franchise, matters were not at an utter standstill. In 1804 the borough of Aylesbury underwent the same treatment that had been meted out 30 years previously to Shoreham and Cricklade. And in 1815 only the action of the House of Lords saved Helston from the same fate. To be sure, 2 attempts to obtain an amendment of the Treating Act, which would render corruption at elections more difficult, were unsuccessful. Nevertheless, in 1809 an important step was taken. The affair of the Duke of York led to the revelation of another scandal, the barter, namely, of a seat in Parliament for a post in the government service. For a member, who had owed his election in 1807 to the support of the government, voted against it on the Duke of York scandal. Lord Castlereagh demanded and obtained his resignation, as though he had been guilty of a breach of contract. Public opinion was strongly excited, and the Whig Kirwan took advantage of this favourable opportunity to carry a bill against corruption at elections, for it provided that whether the bribe offered were money or a place, both the giver and the recipient should be liable to a heavy fine. Grumblers in the ranks of the opposition complained that the measure was doomed to remain inoperative. Registered. Was this complaint justified? One thing at least is certain. The traffic in seats was no longer carried on openly by means of advertisements in the newspapers. There is even some contemporary evidence for the view that the reform initiated by Kirwan went deeper than this. In 1812 Romilly resigned himself to enter Parliament as the client of an aristocratic connection, because, as he said, Kirwan's act had made it impossible for him to purchase his seat with hard cash, as he would otherwise have done. At the same moment Lord Liverpool was deploring, in a private letter, the novel difficulties encountered by the government in preparing elections as the result of this statute. M.R. Kirwan's bill, he wrote to Sir William Scott, has put an end to all money transactions between government and the supposed proprietors of boroughs. Our friends, therefore, who look for the assistance of government must be ready to start for open boroughs, where the general influence of government, combined with a reasonable expense on their own part, may afford them a fair chance of success. If, nevertheless, we are still of the opinion, an opinion fully justified by the facts, that during the period of which we are treating the efforts of the opposition on behalf of reform were deficient both in zeal and in efficacy, extenuating circumstances may be pleaded in favour of the Whigs, and the timidity they displayed need not be ascribed wholly to motives of self-interest. In countries where there exists either universal or almost universal suffrage, it happens constantly that democratic parties hesitate to bring forward measures obviously demanded by the interests of the masses, not from selfish calculation but because the measures in question are opposed to the prejudices of the people themselves. Man is not governed by interest, but by beliefs and passions, and about 1815 the beliefs and passions prevalent among the people favoured the party in office. Why, it may be asked, had not the opposition persisted since 1809 in a unanimous demand for a reform of the franchise, and why from 1815 onwards did it fail to conduct a campaign in favour of free trade? To ask such a question is to confuse 1809 and 1815 with 1832 and 1846. Radicalism was not yet a popular creed, and some years had yet to elapse before the small group of radical reformers in the metropolis could effect a junction with the crowd of workmen who were smashing looms and machinery in Lancashire and Yorkshire. When Parliament raised the duty on corn and tried to establish a monopoly of the national market in favour of the English farmers, the entire population was in arms against the measure. It was in truth a flagrant instance of a majority in Parliament betraying the electorate. This uprising of public opinion, however, had been extremely sudden, so sudden that both parties were taken unawares, and the Commons took the lesson to heart and would never dare to repeat the mistake then made. Again, there were two important questions demanding solution, on which politicians were obliged to come to a definite decision before any other question could be tackled. The first of these was the question of the war. So long as Napoleon had been Emperor of the French, peace, however desirable, had been out of the question. Therefore the Tories, who were the war party, were supported by the nation. Now that peace was restored and Napoleon vanquished, the Tories were certainly deprived of this appeal. But the other question remained, the question of Catholic emancipation. Brought forward in a most clear and definite form 15 years earlier, it had been confronting politicians ever since, and ever since it had remained a cardinal point of difference between the two parties. All the different groups composing the opposition, Welsleyites, Canningites, Greyites, Grenvillites, though they disagreed on so many points, were at one in demanding the complete emancipation of the Catholics. But until the final settlement of the question, the Whigs would be confronted with the combined opposition of the court and the country at large. The year 1829, when at length they would win the support of the nation on this important issue and Catholics would be admitted to Parliament and the public service, would prove fatal to the old Tory party. For the moment, however, the Tories did not owe their majority solely to the exercise of pressure on government officials or to bribes of money and place. It was with the no popery cry that they intimidated the opposition and secured, together with the confidence of the regent, the support of the electorate and public opinion. These, then, were the causes whose operation maintained in power the small group of mediocrities who at this period shaped the policy of the country. On a host of questions, whose solution was daily more urgent, the country was growing ever more and more dissatisfied with the party in office, but on two fundamental questions it remained the popular party. Moreover, although in 1815 the ministers were men of indifferent ability and personally unpopular, they were, nevertheless, the heirs of a great statesman and still profited by the renown attaching to his name. Personally they were narrow-minded reactionaries. But in 1784 Pitt had succeeded in infusing fresh life into the party because he had been able to make it for a time the popular party, and he had strengthened the crown and the established institutions of the realm by imparting indirectly to both a more democratic character. 188. 15. Pitt's first step, when chosen by King George to succeed Lord North as Prime Minister, had been to dissolve Parliament and make, as he termed it, an appeal to the people, one who were thus called upon to decide between the policy of the crown and that of the great aristocratic connections. Twice already, in 1774 and in 1780, the king and his ministers in defiance of custom had dissolved Parliament before the period had expired for which it had been elected. But on both these occasions the government had possessed a majority in the Parliament thus dissolved. Now, however, the innovation was made of dissolving a Parliament where the majority was opposed to the policy of the government that dissolved it. Henceforward dissolution in these circumstances became customary. Between 1784 and 1815 no Parliament lasted longer than 6 years out of the 7 for which it was legally entitled to continue. The Parliament elected in 1802 was dissolved 4 years later, this time by a coalition ministry of Whigs. The Parliament of 1806 lasted only a few months, and that of 1807 was dissolved at the end of 5 years. Dissolution after an important government defeat was indeed destined to become, during the 19th century, a maxim of the Constitution. Nevertheless, towards the close of the 18th century the use made by George III of this novel procedure gave rise to complaints. Suppose, it was urged, an executive able to exert sufficient pressure on the country to secure a strong and obedient majority in the new Parliament, suppose also a servile but influential body of officials and a narrow and venal electorate. In such circumstances was there not a considerable danger that the pretended appeal to the people would be no more than an instrument with which the government enforced its will? Nor was it, it would be added, necessary to imagine conditions so unfavorable to perceive the evils which might result from the practice of dissolution. Even if the result of a general election did truly represent the will of the people, and even if at the actual moment of election the will of the people was at one with the will of the ministry on the particular issue then before the public, it would be easy for a clever statesman to watch his opportunity, dissolve, obtain a majority, and thenceforward govern the country, with or without public support, till the legal duration of Parliament had expired. These observations were well founded, but it is undeniable that the adoption of this procedure by George III and his ministers towards the close of the century signified a democratic development of government. As we have seen already, according to the accepted constitutional theory, the representatives returned every 7 years constituted from the moment of election the legal country. On every question which presented itself while their mandate lasted, their votes were to be determined not by their constituents' wishes but by their own judgment. This fiction of a parliament independent of public opinion during the interval between elections was undoubtedly modified by the exercise of the rights of meeting and association, and by the freedom of the press. It was, moreover, expressly contradicted by the practice of dissolution. The moment a prime minister, who was opposed to a measure approved by the majority in Parliament as, for example, the India Bill of 1784 and Catholic emancipation in 1807 appealed to the judgment of the country, he recognized that the electors had the right, indeed the duty, to exercise a constant control not only over the choice but over the votes of their representatives. George III went even further. He called upon the country to decide between the policy he personally favored and the policy of the majority in Parliament. By this step the fiction of royal irresponsibility was considerably qualified. The policy adopted by the Tories during the closing years of the 18th century transformed the constitutional into a popular monarchy, in which the king assumed the power to resort at pleasure to a species of plebiscite. In 1784 and in 1807 the result of the plebiscite had been favorable to the crown. Sometimes the Canute majority yielded to the sovereign's wishes to save him the necessity of dissolving Parliament, and provoking a constitutional crisis when the country was passing through a period of stress and danger. Thus in 1800 Pitt's party had yielded, with his consent, on the question of Catholic emancipation. Nor was it only by making Parliament more closely dependent upon the electorate that the action of Toryism in this reign had been revolutionary. Its action in modifying the composition of the Commons and the Lords had been even more revolutionary. Since 1792 fear of Jacobinism had driven a certain number of noble families into alliance with the court. The Dukes of Portland, Newcastle, and Rutland supported the royal policy, and thus counterbalanced the influence of the Dukes of Bedford, Norfolk, and Devonshire. Nevertheless, when George III ascended the throne, he could scarcely have counted on disunion among the great families to overcome their opposition. Even the Tory gentry of the provinces were not sufficiently pliable to be always subservient to his wishes. He turned accordingly to the nouveau riches, who wanted to improve their social position by a seat in Parliament. These he found prepared, as the price of his favours, to play the Tory on every occasion. The most zealous members of the party, now known as the party of the King's Friends, were the nabobs, adventurers who, having made their fortunes in India, had returned home to enjoy the fruits of commercial or administrative robbery. Warren Hastings was the typical representative of this class, and his great accuser, Burke, who represented Whig aristocracy, probably detested in Hastings not so much the oppressor of the Hindus as the agent of the Tories. When in 1784 Pitt became head of the government, he did but carry further a practice already 20 years old. Addington, Huskisson, Canning who, as his biographer tells us, had in 1792 wavered between the two parties until he was forced into the Tory ranks by the insolence of the leading Whigs Charles Long, George Rose, all these leading statesmen of humble origin owed their political career to Pitt. All were young when the century opened. In 1815, when all the leaders of the party once led by Fox were dead or dying, they were still active politicians in many instances full of ambition and with a great future before them. Innovators love the young, and Pitt was an innovator. When, 15 years before the close of the 18th century, the royal policy triumphed with Pitt's accession to power, the Tory party thus renovated found I9-I5. Itself in sympathy, in more decided sympathy than the old Whigs, with the new currents of public opinion. We have reached the period when economics first became a science, and when the theories of industrial and commercial liberalism were being widely accepted. Pitt adopted the ideas of the new school. He put into practice the sinking fund system preached by the economist, Richard Price. He concluded a commercial treaty with France in accordance with the doctrines of Adam Smith. It was only natural that he sought recruits for his party among the men whose interests were expressed by the novel doctrines, among those who represented classes of growing importance, the new families of finance, commerce, and manufacture. Cobbett in 1802 protested against the invasion of the governing class by these newcomers. The ancient nobility and gentry of the kingdom, he said, have, with a very few exceptions, been thrust out of all public employments. A race of merchants and manufacturers and bankers and loan jobbers and contractors have usurped their place. This was also the period when the evangelical revival began to influence the English middle class, the class in which these new fortunes were made and from which Pitt's party drew so many followers. Pitt was himself in sympathy with the movement. Wilberforce, the leader of the evangelical group in Parliament, was his friend and supporter. The four Thorntons, the Christian bankers, belonged both to the group over which Wilberforce presided and to the party led by Pitt. This combination of business and Christianity, of trade and asceticism, lent itself to satire. There always was, wrote Cobbett, amongst the creatures and close adherents of Mr. Pitt, a strange mixture of profligacy and cant, jobbers all the morning and Methodists in the afternoon. Such, nevertheless, was the new spirit. Against this youthful ardor, this untiring commercial and philanthropic activity, of what avail were the classical tirades of Fox, who read the Nate on his deathbed one but admitted that he had never read The Wealth of Nations degree during the 10 years since Pitt's death. The Tories, it is true, had visibly deteriorated. They were on the way to becoming once more a party narrowly conservative, rural, out of touch with the progressive forces of the nation. The industrialists had already begun to leave their ranks. In the Corn Bill debates Sir Robert Peel took up an attitude of energetic opposition to the cabinet. Pitt's former lieutenant, George Rose, earned several months' popularity by an important speech delivered against the policy of agrarian protection, a speech drawn from him by the disgust he felt at the Tories' unfaithfulness to his master's ideas. As the result of all these factors, the year 1815 found at Westminster a discredited opposition facing a discredited government, though this state of affairs was of but a few years' standing. At the opening of the 18th century the Whig party had consisted of an alliance of the great landed families and the merchants against the Tory gentry. 100 years later the Tory party as reconstituted by William Pitt was an alliance of the gentry and the industrialists against the great Whig families. The revolutionary activity pursued by the Tories since the accession of George III was not confined to the Commons. It embraced the Lords also. Till 1760 the number of peers had remained almost stationary. In 1688 there had been 150 temporal peers, in 1719 there were 178, and in 1760 only 174. These 174 peers represented the elite of the old English families. In almost every case their titles were older than the reigning dynasty. The Whig spirit inspired this small circle. To extend his influence, George III decided to employ a method which would be strictly constitutional. By creating a sufficient number of peers to swamp the Whig majority in the upper house, while making these creations the reward for services done to himself in the Commons by the clients of the new peers, he would strengthen simultaneously his position in both houses. Few years passed without the creation of new peers. 7 were created in 1771, 11 in 1776, 8 in 1780. Between 1760 and 1784 43 peers were created in all, exclusive of 59 new Irish peerages, which did not carry with them a seat in the House of Lords. Pitt continued on a grander scale the practice inaugurated by King George. Unfettered by aristocratic prejudice, unmoved by personal sympathies, he was swayed only by his ambition. His supremacy in the Commons was uncontested, and his intention to exercise the same authority over the Lords was evident, when in the course of a single session he made his intimate friend and colleague Grenville first appear, then leader of the Upper House *. During the 17 years of his first ministry, Pitt created 95 new peers, exclusive of 77 Irish. 2 among them were lawyers, sailors, soldiers, and a few diplomats. But in the majority of cases the new creations were due to electoral considerations. Already in 1792 it was calculated that 9 of the peers recently created nominated directly or indirectly through their influence 24 members of the House of Commons. As a Thule, titles were conferred on members of old families. Thus the second son of the Duke of Northumberland was created Earl of Beverley, Sir James Lowther, Baron Lonsdale, and Mr. Henry Lascelles, Baron Harewood. The British aristocracy could further accept with equanimity the grant of an Irish peerage to Robert Clive, the military adventurer, famous for his conquest of India, nor need they feel disenured when a peerage of Great Britain with the title of Earl of Powys was bestowed on his son, the patron of 5 seats in Shropshire and Montgomeryshire. Other creations, however, creations sufficiently numerous to excite contemporary indignation, had been frankly purchased with hard cash, or political services by men devoid of merit or birth. The Great Creation of 1797, when 16 peerages were conferred, excited particular scandal. There was an elusive air of antiquity about some of these titles, which disguised the novelty of the patent. When, for instance, the Duke of Bolton died without heirs, a Mr. Thomas Ord, who had wedded his natural daughter, adopted the title. Although there would no longer be a Duke of Bolton, there would be a Baron Bolton. Mr. Robert Smith, a London banker, discovered that in the 17th century the patronymic of the Lords Carrington had been Smith, therefore when he was raised to the peerage by Pitt he took the title of Baron Carrington. This multiplication of peerages continued under Addington's ministry, under Pitt's second ministry, and under the ministry of all the talents. 5 years witnessed the creation of 28 English peerages and 1 Irish. The number of peers had been almost doubled since the accession of George II. After this the rate of creations diminished. Ministers of indifferent ability, timid and conservative, no longer turned out peers in batches. In 1810 a speaker belonging to the party in office stated that during the last 3 years, apart from the military peerages, themselves few in number, the cabinet had created only 2 peers. From 1810 to 1812 the regent was legally incapable of creating peers. But the years 1814 and 1815 witnessed once more the creation of peerages on a lavish scale. These, however, had, strictly speaking, no political significance. The government was obliged to find a reward for victorious generals, hence the majority of the new peers. Nevertheless, from our present point of view these military peerages were not without significance. Still less can we leave out of account the legal peerages, now increasingly numerous. Both classes of peerage tended to change radically the character of the Sea House of Lords. It was now no longer a close, or all but close, caste, but had become, to employ the phrase current in Napoleonic France, open to talent. Eloquent of this change was the custom which had become common since the accession of George I of allowing admirals and generals on their elevation to the peerage to take their title not from an English locality but from a victory. Napoleon took this English custom as his model. We must, of course, beware of pressing too far the parallel between the peerage of King George and Napoleon's peerage. According to Pitt's system the peerage was open even more to intrigue than to merit, and in so far as it was open to merit, was confined to servants of the state. Scholars, men of letters, and artists were excluded. Nevertheless, the English conception of aristocracy was undoubtedly being modified. God Almighty, Selden had written in the 17th century, cannot make a gentleman, and Bailey, in the 1707 edition of his dictionary, did but develop Selden's paradox, when he defined a gentleman as a man who has received his nobility from his ancestors, not from the munificence of a prince or estate. 1. At the beginning of the 18th century it was by no means uncommon for a gentleman to refuse to change the old family name which he derived from his ancestors for a title which he would owe to the favour of the sovereign. The House of Lords was becoming more and more a house of noblemen, less and less a house of gentlemen. Not only titles of nobility, but also orders of knighthood were at the disposal of the executive to reward services to the state or the party, and to arrange English society in nicely graded ranks. In 1807 one of his friends on a visit to London wrote as follows to Constable the publisher. On the whole, it is impossible not to admire the peers, so truly noble-looking and finely dressed, with their stars, garters, etc., etc. They look so much better than the other classes of mankind the commons even appeared to me like trash compared with them. But these orders did not merely augment the glamour of peers, they furnished consolation prizes for those who desired a peerage and whom it was impossible to satisfy. The Tories, therefore, while multiplying peerages, increased simultaneously the number and importance of the orders of knighthood. In 1783 George III founded the Irish Order of St. Patrick as a counterpart to the English Garter and the Scottish Thistle. When in 1786 his sons were invested with the Garter, he enlarged the order, and prescribed that it should henceforward consist of 25 knights, exclusive of the king and his sons. 3 That the restoration of peace might be celebrated by a lavish distribution of honours, the Order of the Bath was reorganized, the number of knights considerably increased, and within the order itself a hierarchy established of grand crosses, commanders, and companions. The innovation aroused great opposition, not only among the great aristocratic families, but generally throughout the gentry. It was denounced as an imitation of the decorations distributed on the continent, and a plagiarism of Napoleon's methods. The reformed order received the nickname of the New Legion of Honor. The imitation was undeniable. Popular opinion, however, could hardly be expected to share these prejudices of the aristocracy, or take offense when to the hereditary hierarchy of peerages the government added another and a strictly personal hierarchy of honors. If the cabinet had entertained for a moment the idea of confining the new order to the nobility, the idea was immediately abandoned. The primary object, nay the very raison d'etre of the order, as of the Legion of Honor, was to reward meritorious service in the army and navy. Nevertheless, an unprecedented step was taken, and the first line of companions of the Bath included Sir Joseph Banks, the president of the Royal Society, whose title to distinction was neither military nor political, but purely intellectual. A final question remains. To what extent were the political color and influence of the upper house modified by these changes in its composition? For 1815 the question is difficult to answer. Only a conflict with the Commons could have settled the question decisively, and for the moment both houses were agreed on all important issues. The same class and the same party were dominant in both alike. It is, nevertheless, a fact worth remark that as a general rule the House of Lords defended established abuses with greater obstinacy than the Commons. The majority of its members owed their rank to the Crown, and were more closely attached to the reigning dynasty than in the days when the British aristocracy despised the royal family as a line of foreign intruders. And the self-made man is always the most obstinate reactionary. The day was even now in sight when the House of Commons would yield more readily to the pressure of the nation's will. The Lords, on the other hand, would fulfill the prediction made by Wilkes when Pitt began to multiply his new peers and become the dead weight of the Constitution. We have yet to discover the effect on the national destinies of this conservatism of the Lords. The Commons would always possess the effective control of government. An ambitious statesman would have as little desire, as in the 18th century, to be promoted to the upper house, and would regard such promotion as a restraint, a proof indeed that his active career was at an end. The House of Lords was at most a check upon the Commons. It did not attempt to extend its right of revision in matters of finance, which had been very closely curtailed in the course of the last century. Everything, in fact, points to the conclusion that not only had the prestige of the upper house not increased, it had positively diminished. Its pomp, it is true, was still impressive. Nevertheless, at the time of the Revolution of 1688, when a peerage was a privilege confined to a very small number, a title was held in greater esteem than at present. If ever a conflict should arise between the two houses on any matter of importance, the upper house would be adopting an extremely hazardous course if it should attempt, in conjunction with the crown, the defense of laws condemned by the popular chamber. It was now 60 years since the House of Lords had ceased to be an inviolable and immutable institution. 16. It must now be evident that the Tory reaction amounted, when all is said, to very little. The political passions exploited by the Tory leaders, the catchwords so frequently on their lips, differed in no essential point from the mass of sentiments and commonplaces which had composed the Whiggery of 60 years earlier. In 1815, as in 1760, the party in office, though Whig then and Tory now, was the party of war, and moreover of war with France, and a Protestant party resolved to maintain the penal laws enacted against Catholics. The Tories of 1815, in their struggle against the Jacobin Revolution and the Empire, posed, as the Whigs had done formerly in their struggle against the Bourbons, as the defenders of the freedom of Europe, threatened with French domination. It was Burke, a Whig who had gone over to Pitt's party, a great orator, a great writer, and, we must add, a great thinker, who developed, in opposition now to the new theories of democracy, as earlier in opposition to attempted encroachments of the crown, the theory of a system inseparably liberal and aristocratic. The Tories, moreover, were supported, or rather had been supported during the greater part of the war, by the same combination of interests which had formerly supported the Whigs: finance, commerce, and industry, that is, by the most enterprising and innovating elements in the country. Nor is it true that the increase of the standing army was a danger to public liberty. The British army possessed none of the characters of an army which could accomplish a coup d'état. Moreover, peace had scarcely been concluded before Parliament began to insist on the reduction of the military forces. In fact, the reform of the public services had already been taken in hand, and some tentative steps had even been taken towards the reform of the franchise. And these were assuredly but the first symptoms of a mighty movement of reform. No doubt in 1815. 199. The cabinet and its supporters were obstinate defenders of every existing institution. The policy of those in power was one of legislative stagnation. Nevertheless, a reform of the traditional body of legislation had already begun, and the stagnation had been far more complete in the period of Whig rule, when Walpole or Chatham governed the country. Nor had the system of government changed. There was still the same mixed constitution, of which we may say with Montesquieu that it was based on the separation of powers, provided we do not understand by that a separation rigidly defined by express statutes. It was a constitution in which the lines of demarcation between the different powers were blurred and confused, to the detriment indeed of the executive, but to the advantage of the legislature and public opinion. The government was systematically weakened, always a prey to internal strife, and deprived by the constitution itself of the necessary means to repress economic or religious disorders, the war of classes and creeds. Nevertheless, in the course of the coming century the British government was destined to give proof of greater stability than any other government in Europe. How are we to explain the apparent paradox? The solution of the problem might be sought in a number of accidental circumstances. It might be said that England, as an insular state, could endure an anarchic constitution, such as no continental state could accept if it would not lie at the mercy of a foreign invader. It might also be said that it would be difficult for a revolution to alter the form of government in a country where, owing to the weakness and inertia of the executive, there existed no central authority of which an active minority might take possession to refashion thus the body politic. These explanations are not wholly worthless, but they are insufficient. What actually took place in England was this. The elements of disorder and anarchy inherent in the political tradition of the country lost their character and submitted insensibly to a discipline freely accepted. Though sects multiplied, sectarian animosities died down. Riot was softened into peaceable demonstration, and civil war became a party strife, waged in accordance with rules freely admitted on either side. We must, therefore, seek elsewhere, in the economic organization or the religious life of the nation, the secret of this progressive regulation of liberty.